Some silences are louder than sound. Birch Creek cuts through the eastern interior of Alaska like a scar through granite. The waterway stretches 126 miles through the Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve, winding between spruce forests and tundra ridges that see no roads, no cell towers, and almost no human presence outside of summer float trips and the occasional supply flight. The area is designated wilderness, over 2 million acres of it, and has been since 1980. Before that, it was trappers' country, then gold rush overflow, then nothing again. The National Park Service maintains 2 remote ranger cabins along the creek. Resupply happens by bush plane or not at all. The terrain is unforgiving in the way only interior Alaska can be. Winters reach 50 below. Summers bring mosquitoes in biblical density. The preserve sits roughly 100 miles east of Fairbanks, but the distance means little when weather can ground aircraft for weeks. Few people go there. Fewer stay long. It is the kind of place the state forgets about until something goes wrong. In late April of 1998, something did. Michael Dalton had been flying bush routes for 11 years. He operated out of Fairbanks, running supplies to cabins, hunting camps, and Park Service outposts scattered across the interior. His Cessna 185 was older than he was, but it flew clean, and Dalton knew the routes by heart. On April 23rd, he was scheduled for a routine drop at the Upper Birch Creek Ranger cabin food. Propane, a replacement radio battery. The flight plan was filed. Weather was clear. He took off just after noon, 40 minutes into the flight. While passing over the southern bend of Birch Creek near coordinates 65.4 north, 143.7 west, Dalton's radio went silent. Not dead, not crackling with interference. Silent. He described it later in a report filed with the Federal Aviation Administration. The ambient hum that exists on every open frequency, the baseline noise of a live channel vanished. He tried switching frequencies. He tried his backup handheld. He checked the circuit breakers. Everything appeared functional, but there was no sound, no static, no echo of his own voice on transmission. Just a void where signal should have been. It lasted 7 minutes. Then, mid-silence, a voice came through. It was the Fairbanks Flight Service Station, continuing a sentence they had started before the silence began. The controller did not acknowledge any gap. The timestamp on the recorded transmission showed no interruption. When Dalton reported the event after landing, the FSS operator insisted the conversation had been continuous. The audio logs confirmed it. 7 minutes of Dalton's flight were missing from his perspective, but not from anyone else's. He filed the report and forgot about it, until it happened again. On June 9, 1998, a pilot named Rebecca Torrens flew the same route. She was carrying mail and a passenger, a Park Service botanist, heading into the field. Torrens had flown in Alaska for 6 years and knew Dalton casually. She had never heard about his report. Over the same section of Birch Creek, her radio went silent. The botanist, seated beside her, noticed her expression change. He asked if something was wrong. She gestured to the radio and mouthed the words. No sound. It lasted 7 minutes. When the radio returned, it resumed a weather advisory that had been playing before the silence. The timestamp was continuous. The Fairbanks controller heard nothing unusual. Torrens did not file a formal report. She mentioned it to another pilot over drinks in Fairbanks 2 weeks later. That pilot, a man named Eugene Sokolov, laughed and said Dalton had described the same thing. Torrens went quiet. She asked for details. Sokolov gave them. Same coordinates, same duration, same impossible return to a conversation that had never stopped. Torrens called the FAA the next day. Her report was added to Dalton's file. 2 incidents. Same location, same phenomenon. No explanation. By August, there were 4. The third pilot was a cargo contractor named Stan Overbeck. He was flying fuel drums to a mining exploration camp north of the preserve when his radio cut out over Birch Creek. He assumed equipment failure until the radio returned exactly 7 minutes later, mid-sentence, as though nothing had happened. He radioed the Fairbanks Tower and asked if they had noticed any interruption. They had not. Overbeck landed, checked his equipment, and found no faults. He filed a maintenance report, but did not mention the location. When an FAA technician later cross-referenced the GPS data, the coordinates matched. The fourth was a pilot named Lydia Shu. She flew for a wildlife survey contract and had logged over 2,000 hours in Alaskan airspace. On August 19, 1998, she experienced the silence while conducting a moose population count along Birch Creek. Her co-pilot, a biologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, experienced it simultaneously. Both described the same thing: total absence of sound on all frequencies, followed by seamless resumption. The ground crew monitoring the flight heard no gap. Shu filed a formal incident report the same day. 4 pilots, 7 months, same coordinates, same duration. The FAA opened a case file. They labeled it an equipment anomaly and began reviewing radio infrastructure across the interior. There were no broadcast towers near Birch Creek, no military installations, no high-voltage lines or geological formations known to interfere with VHF frequencies. The preserve was as empty as land gets in Alaska. The investigation found nothing. A senior FAA inspector named Gordon Pruitt was assigned to interview the pilots. Pruitt had worked in Alaska since 1974 and had seen his share of unexplained radio behavior: auroras, ice crystals, temperature inversions. He did not believe in mysteries, only incomplete data. Dalton told him the silence was not like interference. Interference had texture pops, hiss, warble. This had been absence, a hole where sound should exist. Torrens described it as auditory blindness, the feeling of hearing nothing when you should hear something. Overbeck said it felt like the radio was still on, still transmitting, but the signal was going somewhere else. Shu was more precise. She said it felt like the air itself had stopped carrying waves. Pruitt filed his findings in November of 1998. He concluded that all 4 pilots were credible, experienced, and flying functional equipment. He noted that the phenomenon appeared localized and temporally consistent. He recommended continued monitoring and suggested that atmospheric scientists review the area for anomalous conditions. His report was forwarded to the National Weather Service and the Geophysical Institute at the University of Alaska. Neither organization pursued it. No further incidents were reported in 1999 or 2000. The file was marked inactive in 2001. But the pilots kept talking. In small hangars across Fairbanks, the story circulated quietly. Dalton mentioned it to students in a bush flying course he taught. Torrens told other contractors. Shu brought it up during a wildlife service meeting. The story spread in the way aviation stories do, slowly, informally, without ever reaching official channels. By 2005, most pilots flying the interior had heard some version of it. Some avoided the area. Others flew through it deliberately, waiting for the silence. None reported experiencing it again. In 2012, a journalist named Aaron Wexler began researching unexplained phenomena in Alaskan aviation for a freelance article. He contacted Dalton, who was still flying, and Shu, who had moved to Oregon. Both confirmed their accounts. Wexler requested the FAA case file under the Freedom of Information Act. He received a redacted summary and a note stating that the original file had been transferred to an unspecified federal agency in 2002. No further details were provided. Wexler's article was never published. He moved on to other projects. The story faded again. Birch Creek remains remote. The ranger cabins are still resupplied by air. Pilots still fly over the southern bend where the silence occurred. The coordinates are unchanged. The airspace is open. Nothing on the maps suggests anything unusual. But some pilots, the ones who have flown long enough, will alter their route by a few miles, not because they were told to, not because of any regulation, just because it seems like the right thing to do. The last known mention of the incident came in 2018, when an unnamed source contacted a podcast focused on aviation anomalies. The source claimed to be a former FAA technician who had worked on the case. They stated that the silence had been recorded in cockpit voice recorders from two of the planes, but the recordings showed only ambient noise, no silence, no gap. The pilots heard nothing. The recorders heard everything. The source declined to provide documentation and did not respond to follow-up requests. No explanation was ever issued. No scientific study was conducted. The case file remains transferred, its contents unknown. The preserve is still there. The creek still runs. And somewhere above it, in a column of air that looks like any other, 7 minutes continue to vanish without ever being gone. Some intrusions leave no trace except the certainty that they happened. Chicken, Alaska, sits 66 miles from the Canadian border along the Taylor Highway, a seasonal gravel road that closes each winter when snow makes it impassable. The town was named during the gold rush of 1896, when miners wanted to call it Ptarmigan, but could not agree on the spelling. They settled on Chicken instead. The name stuck, the gold did not. By the 1930s, the population had collapsed. By 2000, fewer than 20 people lived there year-round. The town exists as a historical oddity, a collection of weathered cabins, a seasonal cafe, a gift shop that opens for tourists in summer, and not much else. No grocery store, no gas station. The nearest services are in Talk, 78 miles southwest. In winter, Chicken becomes a place where people go to disappear from the world, or at least from the parts of it that require infrastructure. The residents are miners, trappers, and those who prefer isolation to society. They check their mail once a week. When the postal contractor makes the run from Tok, the mailboxes stand in a row along the main road, each marked with a name or number, each locked. In January of 2003, the temperature dropped and stayed down, -30, -35. On the night of January 12th, it reached -40. The kind of cold that turns breath to ice and makes metal brittle. The kind that keeps even the most experienced outdoorsmen inside unless they have no choice. On the morning of January 13th, a woman named Maureen Calloway walked to her mailbox to retrieve a package she had been expecting. The box was a metal unit mounted on a post, painted green with a keyed lock. She opened it and found her mail inside letters, a catalog, the package. Everything appeared normal. She took the mail back to her cabin and did not think about it again until later that afternoon, when her neighbor, a man named Douglas Fisk, stopped by. Fisk told her something strange had happened. His mail had been disturbed, not stolen, but moved. He had received 3 letters the previous week and had left them in the mailbox, planning to retrieve them when he made his weekly supply run to Tok. That morning, he found them still inside, but they had been taken out of their envelopes, unfolded, and placed back inside the box. The envelopes were neatly slit open. The letters were refolded along their original creases. Nothing was missing. Calloway went back to her mailbox. She checked the lock. It was still secure. She examined the contents more carefully. Her package had been opened. The tape along the seam had been cut cleanly and reapplied. The contents, a set of batteries and a paperback book, were inside, untouched. The catalog had been flipped through. She could tell because the pages no longer lay flat. Someone had opened her mail, examined it, and returned it. She and Fisk spent the next hour walking to the other mailboxes along the road. There were 17 in total, each belonging to one of the town's residents. They checked each one. Every mailbox had been opened. Every piece of mail had been removed, examined, and replaced. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. But everything had been touched. The snow around the mailboxes was undisturbed. No footprints. no vehicle tracks, no sign that anyone had walked or driven along the road. The snow had fallen 2 days earlier, on January 11th, and had not been touched since. Chicken receives little traffic in winter. The road is closed to through traffic, and the few residents who remain rarely leave their properties when temperatures drop below -30. The snow was a blank surface, smooth and unbroken, surrounding every mailbox. Fisk called the Alaska State Troopers from a satellite phone. The nearest detachment was in talk. A trooper named Raymond Bouchard drove out the following day. He arrived in the afternoon and interviewed each of the 17 residents. All confirmed the same thing. Their mail had been opened and returned. None reported hearing or seeing anything unusual on the night of January 12th or the morning of January 13th. Bouchard examined the mailboxes. The locks showed no signs of tampering, no scratches, no damage, no indication that they had been forced. He photographed the snow around each mailbox. The images showed what the residents had described: smooth, undisturbed powder. Bouchard walked the perimeter of the town, checking for tracks leading in from the surrounding forest. He found nothing. He checked the seasonal buildings, the cafe, the gift shop, a small maintenance shed. All were locked and showed no signs of entry. One resident, a man named Victor Lindgren, mentioned that he had been awake late on the night of January 12th. He lived in a cabin with a clear view of the main road. He told Bouchard that he had looked out his window around 2 in the morning and seen nothing unusual, no lights, no movement. He had gone to bed shortly after and heard nothing during the night. Another resident, a woman named Teresa Kowalski, said she had been outside briefly around 11 that night to bring in firewood. She had glanced at the mailboxes and noticed nothing out of place. She estimated she had been outside for less than 5 minutes. The cold had driven her back inside. Bouchard asked if anyone had heard the sound of an engine or a snowmobile. No one had. He asked if anyone had noticed lights or unusual activity in the days leading up to the incident. No one had. He asked if anyone had been expecting a delivery or service. No one had. He returned to Tok and filed a report. The case was labeled as trespassing and mail tampering. Because nothing had been stolen, it was categorized as low priority. Bouchard noted in his report that the lack of physical evidence, footprints, vehicle tracks, forced entry made the case difficult to pursue. He recommended that residents install security measures and report any further incidents. No further incidents were reported. The United States Postal Inspection Service was notified due to the federal nature of mail tampering. An inspector named Angela Briggs reviewed the case in March of 2003. She contacted Bouchard and requested copies of his photographs and witness statements. She noted the unusual circumstances, the lack of theft, the precision of the intrusion, the absence of tracks, but concluded that without physical evidence or ongoing criminal activity, the investigation could not proceed. Her report suggested the possibility of an inside action, though no resident was identified as a suspect. The case was closed in April of 2003. The residents of Chicken did not forget. Calloway installed a motion-activated camera aimed at her mailbox. Fisk began locking his mail inside a secondary container within the mailbox. Others did the same. Lindgren started keeping a log of anyone who passed through town, though in winter that amounted to almost no one. In the months following the incident, a few theories circulated quietly among the residents. Some believed it was a prank, though no one could explain how it had been accomplished without leaving tracks. The snow had been checked within hours of the incident. The temperature that night made extended outdoor activity nearly impossible. Some suggested it was an outsider, someone passing through, though the road had been closed and no vehicles had been reported. Some wondered if it had been done over multiple nights, but the mailboxes had been checked regularly, and the disturbance had occurred in a single event. Kowalski mentioned to a friend in talk that the whole thing felt like someone had been testing them, seeing how much they could do without being noticed. The friend, a mechanic named Leonard Dubois, laughed. and said it sounded like something out of a spy novel. Kowalski did not laugh. She said it felt too deliberate to be random, too careful. In 2006, a journalist named Paul Hirsch passed through Chicken during a summer road trip and heard about the incident from the owner of the seasonal cafe. Hirsch asked for details and was directed to Calloway, who still lived in town. She described the event and showed him the motion camera she had installed. It had captured nothing unusual in the 3 years since. Hirsch contacted Bouchard, who confirmed the basic facts, but declined to speculate. Hirsch wrote a short article for an Anchorage-based magazine. It was published in August of 2006 and received little attention. The case was mentioned again in 2011 on an internet forum dedicated to unexplained events in Alaska. A user claiming to be a former postal contractor in the region stated that they had heard similar stories from other remote towns. Mail being disturbed, but not stolen. Locks being opened without damage. No evidence of entry. The user did not provide specifics and did not respond to follow-up questions. The post was archived and largely forgotten. Chicken remains small. The population has not grown. The mailboxes are still there, lined along the road, each locked. The residents who experienced the incident still live in town. They do not talk about it often. When they do, they speak carefully, as though describing something they are not entirely sure happened, even though they know it did. The snow has come and gone many times since 2003. The temperature still drops to -40 in deep winter. The mailboxes still get checked once a week. And somewhere in the archives of the Alaska State Troopers, a file remains closed, marked with a case number and a single unresolved question. How do you open 17 locked mailboxes in sub-zero cold without leaving a single footprint in fresh snow? Some patterns emerge only after they have been witnessed. Aniakchuk National Monument and Preserve occupies the southern end of the Alaska Peninsula, a remote expanse of volcanic terrain that sees fewer than 100 visitors per year. The centerpiece is Aniakchuk Caldera, a 6-mile-wide crater formed by a catastrophic eruption roughly 3,500 years ago. The caldera floor sits 1,000 feet below the rim, accessible only by steep, unstable trails or by float-plane landing on Surprise Lake, a body of water that occupies the eastern portion of the crater. There are no roads, no maintained trails, no services. The National Park Service describes it as one of the least visited units in the entire system. The climate is harsh even by Alaskan standards. Weather changes without warning. Winds exceed 50 miles per hour regularly. Fog can descend in minutes, erasing visibility and trapping hikers for days. The terrain is loose volcanic ash, sharp basalt, and tundra grasses that conceal unstable ground. The Park Service recommends that visitors carry satellite communication devices and be prepared for self-rescue. Most who go there are experienced backcountry travelers, geologists, or researchers studying volcanic activity. The monument was established in 1978. Before that, it was known primarily to the Shugpiaq people, who avoided the caldera and considered it a place of power and disruption. There are no permanent staff stationed at Aniakchuk. Rangers visit periodically during summer months to conduct surveys and assess conditions. The area remains largely unmonitored. In July of 2009, a geologist named Marcus Delgado led a small research team into the caldera to collect ash samples and document erosion patterns. The team consisted of 4 people: Delgado, 2 graduate students named Olivia Garrett and Samuel Rojas, and a wilderness guide named Bill Townsend. They entered the caldera on July 14th and planned to spend 5 days conducting fieldwork. On the second day, while hiking along the northern interior wall, Garrett noticed a small arrangement of stones near a prominent basalt outcrop. The stones were black volcanic rock, each roughly the size of a closed fist, placed in a line on a flat section of ash-covered ground. There were 3 stones, Garrett photographed them as part of the team's documentation process, noting the location with a GPS unit. The coordinates were 56.8 to 5 north, 158.1 to 5 west. The team continued their work and left the caldera on July 18th. Garrett reviewed her photographs while processing field notes in King Salmon, the nearest town with services. She noticed the stones again in the images, but thought little of it. Volcanic landscapes often contain unusual formations. She assumed they had been placed by a previous visitor or had settled naturally during erosion events. In August of 2010, a backpacking group entered Aniakchuk for a week-long trek. The group included 6 people, among them a photographer named Diana Lau. On August 9th, Lau photographed the same basalt outcrop that Garrett had documented the year before. When she reviewed her images later, she noticed stones arranged near the outcrop. There were 5 stones this time, placed in a line, evenly spaced. Lau posted the photographs to a wilderness photography forum, noting the location and commenting on the stark beauty of the caldera. Garrett saw the post in September of 2010. She recognized the outcrop immediately and compared Lau's photograph to her own from the previous year. The arrangement was similar but not identical. The stones in Lau's image were in the same general area, but there were more of them. Garrett contacted Lau through the forum and asked for the exact coordinates. Lau provided them. They matched Garrett's GPS data within 10 meters. Garrett mentioned the discrepancy to Delgado, who suggested that other visitors had added stones to the site, possibly as cairns or trail markers. Garrett agreed, but remained curious. She contacted the National Park Service office in King Salmon and asked if anyone had reported unusual stone arrangements in the caldera. The ranger she spoke with, a woman named Jennifer Ortega, said no such reports existed in the monument's records. In June of 2011, a solo hiker named Thomas Idowu entered Aniakchuk. Idowu was an experienced wilderness traveler who had been visiting remote Alaskan sites for over a decade. He hiked to the same basalt outcrop on June 23rd and photographed it as part of his trip documentation. When he returned home to Anchorage, he uploaded his photos to a personal blog. The stones were visible in his images. There were 8 of them, arranged in a line. Garrett found the blog in August of 2011 while searching online for references to Aniakchuk. She saw Idowu's photograph and contacted him via email. Idowu confirmed the location and the date. Garrett explained what she had observed. Idowu expressed surprise but offered no explanation. He said he had not moved or placed any stones and had assumed the arrangement was natural or left by others. Garrett compiled the 3 sets of photographs and presented them to Delgado. The pattern was clear: 3 stones in 2009, 5 stones in 2010, 8 stones in 2011. Delgado noted the progression, but cautioned against reading too much into it. Volcanic terrain shifts constantly. Stones could be displaced by wind, erosion, or animal activity. He suggested the additions might be coincidental, or the result of multiple visitors contributing to the same site without coordination. Garrett remained unconvinced. She noted that the stones were not scattered randomly, but placed deliberately in a straight line. She also pointed out that the caldera received very few visitors, perhaps 20 to 30 people per year, and the likelihood of multiple visitors independently adding stones to the same small area seemed low. In 2012, Garrett returned to Aniakchuk with a colleague from the University of Alaska. They hiked to the outcrop on July 7th. The stones were still there. Garrett counted them. There were 13. She photographed the arrangement from multiple angles and collected GPS data. She and her colleague examined the surrounding area for signs of human activity, footprints, disturbed ash, discarded items. They found nothing. The terrain around the outcrop appeared undisturbed, apart from the stones themselves. Garrett reported the findings to the Park Service. Ortega, the ranger in King Salmon, agreed to visit the site during a scheduled patrol. On August 4th, 2012, Ortega and another ranger named Kevin Brunel hiked into the caldera. They located the outcrop and photographed the stones. Ortega's count matched Garrett's, 13 stones arranged in a line. The rangers collected the stones and removed them from the site, placing them in a different area of the caldera approximately 1 mile away. They documented the removal and filed a report noting the unusual arrangement. In June of 2013, a research team from the U.S. Geological Survey visited Aniakchak to monitor seismic activity. One of the team members, a scientist named Laura Pemberton, hiked to the northern interior wall and photographed the basalt outcrop as part of a broader landscape survey. She noticed stones arranged near the outcrop. There were 21 of them. Pemberton contacted the Park Service and described what she had seen. Ortega retrieved the report from 2012 and confirmed that the stones had been removed the previous year. Ortega and Brunel returned to the site on July 19, 2013. They found the stones arranged in the same location where they had been removed. Ortega counted them. There were 21. She photographed the arrangement and removed the stones again, this time placing them in a pile at the base of the outcrop rather than relocating them. In 2014, no visitors reported seeing the stones. The Park Service did not conduct patrols in that area of the caldera due to budget constraints. In 2015, a hiking group entered Aniakchak in late June. One member of the group, a man named Peter Van Doren, photographed the outcrop. The stones were back. Van Doren counted 34. Ortega reviewed the photograph after Van Doren submitted it to the Park Service as part of a trip report. She noted the count and filed it with the previous reports. She contacted the U.S. Geological Survey and asked if any researchers had been in the area. None had. She contacted local guide services and asked if any clients had visited the caldera. None reported trips to that specific location. The sequence 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34 was eventually recognized by a mathematician who came across the reports through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a journalist in 2016. The numbers followed the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical pattern in which each number is the sum of the two preceding ones. The mathematician, a professor at the University of Washington named Gerald Holloway, wrote a brief analysis noting the pattern and suggesting that someone with knowledge of mathematics was deliberately placing the stones. The journalist, a freelance writer named Imogen Swift, contacted the Park Service and requested further information. Ortega provided copies of the photographs and reports, but declined to speculate on the origin of the pattern. Swift attempted to contact individuals who had visited the caldera during the relevant years, but received few responses. Idowu confirmed his earlier account. Van Doren said he had not moved or placed any stones. Pemberton stated she had only photographed the site and had not touched anything. Swift's article was published in an online magazine in March of 2017. It included the photographs and a summary of the known facts. The article generated moderate interest but no new leads. The Park Service issued a statement confirming that the stone arrangements had been documented and removed multiple times, but offered no explanation for their reappearance. In 2018, Ortega retired from the Park Service. Brunel transferred to a different unit. No further patrols were conducted at the outcrop. The caldera remains remote and largely unvisited. The stones, as far as anyone knows, are still there. The photographs remain in Park Service files. The sequence continues in the images 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34. No one has returned to check if the pattern has progressed. No one has determined who places the stones or how they reappear after removal. The outcrop stands on the northern interior wall of the caldera, a fixed point in a landscape that erodes and shifts with each season. And somewhere in the ash and basalt, the stones wait, arranged in a line that counts forward into a sequence no one was meant to finish. Some voices speak from places where no one is transmitting. Galena sits on the north bank of the Yukon River, in the interior of Alaska, roughly 270 miles west of Fairbanks. The town was established as a trading post in the late 1800s and grew during the gold rush, though it never reached the size of other Yukon settlements. By the mid-20th century, it served primarily as a support community for Galena Air Force Station, a Cold War radar installation built in 1951 as part of the distant early warning line. The base employed several hundred personnel at its peak and operated continuously until 1993, when it was decommissioned following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The region is flat, forested, and isolated. Winter temperatures reach -50. The Yukon freezes solid from October through April. The nearest city of any size is Fairbanks, accessible by air or by a winter ice road that remains passable for only a few months each year. Galena's population has never exceeded 600. Most residents are Athabascan, descendants of the Koyukon people who have lived along the Yukon for thousands of years. The land is quiet in a way that only true wilderness can be. Miles of spruce and birch, interrupted by the occasional cabin, the distant sound of a plane, and very little else. In March of 1991, a Federal Aviation Administration technician named Howard Garrett was conducting routine maintenance on radio navigation equipment at Galena Airport. The airport serves as a refueling hub for aircraft traveling between Anchorage and the northern and western villages. It operates a suite of communication and navigation systems, monitored by FAA personnel stationed on site. While testing frequencies, Garrett detected an anomalous transmission on a low band, typically used for emergency locator beacons and long-range navigation signals. The frequency was 1 to 1.5 megahertz, a channel monitored internationally for distress calls. The transmission was faint, but continuous. It did not follow the standard format of an emergency beacon, which emits a distinct repeating pulse. Instead, it sounded like voice low, indistinct, overlapping syllables that Garrett initially assumed were caused by atmospheric interference or a malfunctioning transmitter. He attempted to triangulate the source using directional equipment. The signal appeared to originate from an area southwest of Galena, roughly 15 to 20 miles into uninhabited forest along the Yukon River. Garrett reported the transmission to the FAA regional office in Anchorage. The report was logged on March 17, 1991. Over the following weeks, the signal continued. It broadcast constantly, day and night, without variation in strength or content. Garrett monitored it periodically and noted that the transmission did not correspond to any known aircraft in distress, nor did it match the signature of standard emergency beacons. He forwarded recordings to Anchorage for further analysis. In April, the FAA dispatched a field technician named Robert Nkosi to investigate. Nkosi arrived in Galena on April 9th and spent 3 days attempting to locate the source. Using portable direction-finding equipment, he narrowed the origin to a forested area south of the river, near a bend approximately 18 miles from town. The terrain was accessible only by snowmobile in winter or boat in summer. Nkosi traveled to the area by snowmobile on April 11th, accompanied by a local guide named Thomas Pitka. They searched the area for several hours, but found no evidence of a transmitter, no antennas, no equipment, no structures. The forest was dense and showed no signs of recent human activity. Nkosi tested the signal strength at various points and determined that it was strongest in a clearing roughly 200 yards from the riverbank. He marked the location with GPS coordinates 64.6 to 6 north, 157.0 to 3 west. He found nothing at the site except trees, moss, and snow. Nkosi returned to Galena and filed a report stating that the source could not be visually identified. He noted that the signal strength and direction were consistent with a ground-based transmitter operating at low power, but the absence of physical evidence made further investigation difficult. He recommended continued monitoring and suggested that the transmission might be a reflected signal from a distant source, though he acknowledged that such an explanation did not fully account for the consistency and localization of the broadcast. The recordings were forwarded to the FAA Technical Center in Atlantic City, New Jersey for analysis. In May of 1991, a senior engineer named Patricia Langford reviewed the audio. She confirmed that the transmission was not a standard emergency beacon and did not match any known navigation or communication signal. She described the sound as resembling human speech, rhythmic, modulated, and structured in a way that suggested linguistic content. She recommended that the recordings be examined by specialists in signal analysis and linguistics. The FAA contacted the University of Alaska Fairbanks and provided copies of the recordings to the linguistics department. A professor named Leonard Whitehorse agreed to review them. Whitehorse had spent 30 years studying Athabascan languages and was familiar with the Koyukon dialect spoken in the Galena area. He listened to the recordings in June of 1991 and determined that the transmission was not Koyukon, nor any other Athabascan language he recognized. He noted that the phonetic structure suggested language-repeated patterns, pauses, and tonal variations consistent with grammar and syntax, but the specific sounds did not correspond to any language in his experience. Whitehorse shared the recordings with colleagues at other institutions. A linguist at the University of California, Berkeley, named Yvonne Marchand, analyzed the audio and reached a similar conclusion. She identified approximately 12 distinct phonemes and noted that they occurred in patterns that resembled sentence structure. She attempted to match the patterns to known language families: Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, Athabascan, Eskimo-Aleut, and found no correlation. In her report, dated August 1991, she stated that the transmission exhibited linguistic properties but did not match any documented human language. The FAA continued to monitor the signal throughout 1991. Garrett logged its presence in monthly reports. The transmission never varied in frequency, strength, or content. It continued without interruption through summer, fall, and into winter. Personnel at Galena Air Force Station were informed of the signal and asked to report any unusual activity in the area. None was observed. In December of 1991, a military radio operator at the air station named James Oakpick mentioned the signal to a colleague stationed at Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks. The colleague, a communications specialist named Brian Faulkner, requested copies of the recordings out of curiosity. Faulkner had worked in signals intelligence during the Cold War and was familiar with unusual transmissions. He listened to the recordings and noted that the structure resembled encrypted voice communication, deliberate, patterned, and seemingly intentional. He could not determine the origin or purpose. In January of 1992, the Anchorage Daily News ran a brief article about unexplained radio signals detected in rural Alaska. The article mentioned the Galena transmission without providing specific details. A reporter named Sophie Valdez had contacted the FAA for comment, and a spokesperson confirmed that an anomalous signal had been detected but stated that it posed no safety risk and was under investigation. The article attracted little attention. A few amateur radio enthusiasts contacted the FAA requesting information, but no further media coverage followed. The signal continued. On February 8, 1992, the transmission stopped. Garrett noticed the absence during a routine frequency check. He confirmed that the signal was no longer present on 1 to 1.5 megahertz. He checked adjacent frequencies and found nothing. He filed a report noting the cessation and speculating that the source had either been powered down or had failed. Inkosi was notified, but did not return to Galena to investigate. The area was inaccessible in deep winter, and without an active signal to track, there was little reason to conduct a search. The FAA closed the case in March of 1992. The final report, authored by Langford, summarized the findings. An unidentified transmission had been detected near Galena, Alaska, broadcasting continuously from March 1991 to February 1992. The source could not be located. Linguistic analysis suggested structured communication, but no match to known languages. The transmission ceased without explanation. The report recommended no further action. Whitehorse kept copies of the recordings. He revisited them periodically over the following years, playing them for students and colleagues. No one identified the language. In 2004, he shared the recordings with a computational linguist at MIT named Gregory Stavros, who analyzed them using pattern recognition software. Stavros confirmed the presence of syntactic structure, but could not match it to any database of recorded languages. He suggested the possibility of a constructed language or a heavily degraded signal, though he noted that the clarity and consistency of the transmission made degradation unlikely. In 2009, a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Delacroix contacted Garrett while researching unexplained phenomena in Alaska. Garrett described the Galena signal and provided copies of his reports. Delacroix attempted to locate the original recordings, but learned that they had been archived and were not readily accessible. She contacted Whitehorse, who provided his copies. She included a brief segment about the transmission in a documentary released in 2011. The segment ran less than 5 minutes and received little attention. Galena Air Force Station closed permanently in 1993. The facility was transferred to the state of Alaska and later repurposed as a boarding school. The FAA station remains operational, staffed by a small number of technicians. Garrett retired in 2007. Nkosi transferred to a different region. Whitehorse passed away in 2015. The recordings remain in university archives, accessible but rarely reviewed. No further transmissions have been detected on the frequency. The forest southwest of Galena remains undeveloped and largely unvisited. The coordinates recorded by Nkosi mark a clearing that looks like any other trees, undergrowth, and silence. And somewhere in the archives, the voice continues on tape, whispering in a language no one has ever spoken, repeating patterns no one has ever decoded, counting out syllables in a rhythm that almost sounds like it means something. Some observers leave only their evidence behind. Cape Lisburne extends into the Chukchi Sea on the northwestern coast of Alaska, a limestone promontory that rises abruptly from the water and marks one of the most remote points on the North American continent. The cape was named by British explorer Frederick Beechey in 1826, but the Inupiat people knew it long before as Kaliktuk. The cliffs reach heights of 800 feet and overlook pack ice that drifts south from the Arctic each winter. The wind never stops. The temperature rarely exceeds 50 degrees even in summer. In 1955, the United States Air Force constructed a long-range radar station at Cape Lisburne. As part of the Distant Early Warning Line, a network of radar installations designed to detect Soviet bombers approaching across the polar region. The facility operated continuously throughout the Cold War, staffed by military and civilian personnel who lived in modular buildings anchored to permafrost. The station was one of the most isolated postings in the American military, accessible only by air or by sea during the brief ice-free months. Resupply flights arrived weekly in summer, less frequently in winter. The nearest village, Point Hope, lies 40 miles to the south. After the Cold War ended, the Air Force transferred the station to the Coast Guard, which converted it into a long-range aids-to-navigation site. The facility was scaled down significantly. By 2000, fewer than 10 personnel remained on station at any given time, maintaining navigation equipment and providing search and rescue coordination for the Chukchi coast. The radar domes were decommissioned. Most of the buildings were abandoned. The station became a quiet outpost, visited only by Coast Guard technicians, occasional researchers, and supply contractors. On September 14, 2005, a Coast Guard electronics technician named Vincent Rojas was conducting a perimeter check of the station's fuel storage area. The area is located approximately 400 yards west of the main facility, where the ground slopes toward the sea. Rojas noticed something unusual near a cluster of rusted drums left over from the Air Force years, a rectangular object partially exposed in the gravel. He approached and found a hard-shell waterproof case, the kind used by photographers and outdoorsmen to protect sensitive equipment. The case was sealed and showed no signs of weathering. Rojas carried it back to the station and opened it in the presence of his supervisor, a chief petty officer named Laura Kinney. Inside were a digital camera, 3 memory cards, and a small notebook. The camera was a professional-grade model, relatively new, with no visible identifying marks or serial number. The manufacturer's label had been removed. The memory cards were labeled with dates ranging from January to August of 2005. The notebook contained handwritten entries, mostly technical notes about exposure settings, timestamps, and weather conditions. Rojas and Kinney reviewed the images on the camera's display screen. The photographs showed the Cape Lisburne facility from various angles and distances. Some were taken from the tundra west of the station. Others appeared to have been taken from elevated positions on the ridgeline to the south. The images were high resolution and clearly showed structures, vehicles, and personnel moving around the facility. Many included timestamps embedded in the file metadata. Kinney reported the discovery to the Coast Guard Command in Kodiak. On September 16th, an investigator named Marcus Elwood was dispatched to Cape Lisburne. Elwood had previously worked in Coast Guard intelligence and had experience with security incidents at remote installations. He arrived on September 18th and spent 3 days examining the case and its contents. Elwood extracted the memory cards and transferred the images to a secure computer. There were 237 photographs in total. The earliest was dated January 9th, 2005. The most recent was dated August 27th, 2005. The images were taken at irregular intervals, sometimes days apart, sometimes weeks. The timestamps indicated that some photographs were taken during daylight, others during the twilight of the Arctic summer, and a few during the darkness of winter. Elwood noted several disturbing details. First, many of the photographs were taken from positions that would require significant exposure to the elements. One image, dated February 3rd, appeared to have been taken from a vantage point roughly 2 miles southwest of the station, in an area of open tundra with no natural shelter. The temperature on that date, according to station weather logs, had been negative 28 degrees, with sustained winds of 30 miles per hour. A person standing in that location would experience life-threatening conditions within minutes. Second, several images showed the interior of the station through windows. The angles suggested that the photographer had been positioned on elevated ground or structures that did not exist in those locations. Elwood reviewed topographic maps and confirmed that the sightlines were inconsistent with the terrain. Third, the notebook contained entries that referenced observation sessions and subject movement patterns. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. The entries did not include names or personal information. The language was clinical, almost procedural. One entry, dated March 12th, read, "Subject's routine unchanged. Light discipline maintained after 2,200 hours. No external patrol observed." Kinney and Rojas were interviewed separately. Kinney stated that she had never seen the case before and had no knowledge of unauthorized personnel in the area. She confirmed that the station maintained a log of all visitors, and no civilians or unscheduled personnel had been present during the time frame indicated by the photographs. Rojas stated that he had been stationed at Cape Lisburne since November of 2004 and had never observed anyone on the tundra beyond the station perimeter. Elwood expanded his interviews to include other personnel who had rotated through the station during 2005. A mechanic named Gregory Voss recalled seeing movement on the ridgeline south of the station one evening in March. He described it as a figure standing motionless, silhouetted against the sky. He assumed it was a caribou or a trick of the light and did not report it. A supply coordinator named Diane Mukeba mentioned that she had occasionally felt watched while working outside, but she attributed the feeling to the isolation and the strangeness of the environment. Elwood requested a search of the areas where the photographs appeared to have been taken. On September 21st, he and 2 Coast Guard personnel conducted a foot patrol of the tundra west and south of the station. They covered approximately 6 square miles over 2 days. They found no evidence of human presence, no tent sites, no fire rings, no discarded equipment, no footprints. The ground was a mix of gravel, moss, and permafrost, difficult to traverse and inhospitable to prolonged habitation. Elwood examined the camera more closely. The serial number had been deliberately removed, filed down with precision. He contacted the manufacturer and provided the model information. The company confirmed that the camera had been released in 2004 and was sold through various retail and online channels. Without a serial number, they could not trace the purchase. Elwood submitted the camera and memory cards to a Coast Guard forensic laboratory in Alameda, California. The forensic analysis, completed in October of 2005, yielded limited results. The camera contained no fingerprints, it had been wiped clean. The memory cards showed no evidence of tampering or digital alteration. The images were authentic and had been taken with the camera in question. The metadata confirmed the timestamps. The notebook was examined for forensic evidence. The paper was standard, available at any office supply retailer. The ink was from a common ballpoint pen. No fingerprints were recovered. The Coast Guard expanded the investigation to include a review of flight logs, vessel traffic, and satellite imagery. No unauthorized aircraft or vessels had been recorded in the vicinity of Cape Lisburne during the relevant time frame. Satellite imagery was requested from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. The imagery, reviewed in November, showed the station and surrounding terrain, but provided no evidence of human activity beyond the facility perimeter. Elwood's final report, filed in December of 2005, concluded that an unknown individual or individuals had conducted surveillance of the Cape Lisburne facility over a period of 8 months. The method of surveillance remained unclear. The lack of physical evidence, the extreme environmental conditions, and the absence of recorded access suggested either highly skilled fieldcraft or an explanation that fell outside normal investigative parameters. Elwood recommended increased security measures and continued monitoring. The case was classified as unsolved and referred to Coast Guard intelligence. In 2006, a security consultant named Harold Ng was contracted to review the incident. Ng had experience in counter-surveillance and had worked with military installations in remote environments. He visited Cape Lisburne in July and conducted his own assessment. He reviewed Elwood's report and examined the photographs. In his analysis, he noted that the surveillance appeared methodical and patient, consistent with professional intelligence gathering. He could not explain how the photographer had remained undetected or survived the environmental conditions. He suggested the possibility of a drone or remote camera system, but the angles and perspectives in many images were inconsistent with unmanned equipment. No further incidents were reported. The case was archived in 2007. The camera and memory cards were retained in Coast Guard evidence storage. The notebook was never returned to the field. Personnel stationed at Cape Lisburne were briefed on the incident, but instructed not to discuss it publicly. In 2012, a journalist named Sophie Mercer filed a Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to security incidents at Arctic Coast Guard installations. She received a heavily redacted version of Elwood's report. She contacted Elwood, who declined to comment. She contacted Kinney, who confirmed the basic facts but provided no additional details. Mercer wrote a short article for an online magazine focusing on military mysteries. The article generated minimal attention. The station remains operational. Personnel continue to rotate through on temporary assignments. The tundra stretches in all directions, empty and wind-scoured. The ridgeline to the south is visible from the facility, a dark line against the sky. And somewhere in the Coast Guard archives, 237 photographs wait, each one a record of observation from a place where no one should have been able to stand. Each timestamp, a question that no investigation has answered. Who was watching? And how long were they there before they were found? The Earth is not supposed to have a pulse. Council sits on the Seward Peninsula in northwest Alaska, roughly 70 miles from Nome and 30 miles from the Bering Strait. The town was established during the gold rush of 1897, when prospectors flooded the region searching for placer deposits along the Nukluk River. At its peak, Council supported over 10,000 people. By the 1920s, the gold was gone and so were most of the residents. Today, fewer than 10 people live there year-round. The buildings that remain are weathered and collapsing, slowly reclaimed by tundra and permafrost. The landscape is flat and treeless, covered in low shrubs, lichen, and grasses that turn rust-colored in autumn. The ground is permanently frozen below a thin, active layer that thaws each summer. Permafrost in this region extends hundreds of feet deep, formed over thousands of years. It is stable, ancient, and geologically inert. The Seward Peninsula is not volcanically active. There are no hot springs, no geothermal vents, and no known anomalies in the subsurface geology. It is cold, quiet, and predictable. In June of 2011, a team of researchers from the University of Alaska Fairbanks arrived in Council to conduct a permafrost study. The project was part of a broader effort to document the effects of climate change on Arctic soils. The team consisted of 4 people: Dr. Annette Vega, a geologist specializing in permafrost dynamics; Dr. Kwame Osei, a geophysicist; and 2 graduate students, Elliot Ramos and Yuki Tanaka. They planned to spend 8 weeks collecting soil samples, measuring ground temperatures, and installing monitoring equipment. The team established a field camp 3 miles southwest of Council, near a low ridge that overlooked the Nukluk River. On June 7th, they began drilling boreholes to install thermistor arrays, sensors designed to measure temperature at various depths within the permafrost. The first borehole was drilled to a depth of 12 feet. The sensors were placed at intervals of 2 feet, starting at the surface and extending to the bottom of the hole. Data was recorded continuously and transmitted to a laptop in the field camp. On June 9th, Ramos noticed an irregularity in the temperature readings. The sensors were showing fluctuations small but consistent at all depths. The changes were not random. They occurred in a repeating pattern. The temperature would rise by 0.3 degrees Celsius over 9 seconds, then fall by the same amount over the next 9 seconds. The cycle repeated without variation. Ramos assumed the equipment was malfunctioning and reported it to Vega. Vega examined the data and ran diagnostics on the sensors. The equipment appeared to be functioning correctly. She instructed Ramos to drill a second borehole, approximately 200 yards from the first. New sensors were installed on June 10th. By the evening, the second borehole was showing the same pattern. The temperature fluctuations were identical in magnitude and timing. Both sets of sensors were rising and falling in perfect synchronization. Osei reviewed the data on June 11th. He noted that the 18-second cycle was consistent across all depths in both boreholes. Temperature fluctuations in permafrost are typically caused by solar heating at the surface or seasonal changes in the active layer. Those processes occur over hours or days, not seconds. Osei suggested that the sensors might be detecting seismic activity, but the pattern did not match any known seismic signature. Earthquakes produce sudden, irregular vibrations. This was steady, rhythmic, and continuous. On June 12th, the team drilled a third borehole 1 mile to the west. The same pattern appeared within hours. Vega decided to expand the study. Over the next week, the team installed sensors at 6 additional locations, covering an area roughly 2 miles in diameter. All sites showed the same rhythmic temperature fluctuations. The cycle never varied. 18 seconds up, 18 seconds down. Continuous. Tanaka suggested that the phenomenon might be atmospheric temperature changes caused by wind or air pressure. Osei set up surface weather stations to correlate atmospheric data with the ground temperature readings. The correlation was zero. Air temperature remained stable. Wind speed varied but had no effect on the pattern. The fluctuations were occurring within the permafrost itself, not at the surface. Vega contacted colleagues at the University of Alaska and described the findings. On June 20th, Dr. Harold Winters, a senior geophysicist, arrived in council to review the data. Winters had spent 30 years studying Arctic geology and had never encountered anything similar. He examined the equipment, reviewed the installation procedures, and confirmed that the sensors were functioning correctly. He observed the data in real time and verified the 18-second cycle. He had no explanation. Winters suggested the possibility of subsurface water movement. Groundwater flowing through thawed pockets within the permafrost could theoretically cause localized temperature changes. Osei conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey to detect subsurface water. The survey found no evidence of liquid water or voids within the frozen ground. The permafrost was solid and homogeneous. The team expanded the monitoring array. By early July, sensors had been placed at 14 locations spread across a 2-mile radius. All sites showed the synchronized pattern. The temperature fluctuations were not localized to a single borehole or area. They were occurring simultaneously across the entire study site, as though the ground itself was expanding and contracting in rhythm. On July 8th, Vega contacted the United States Geological Survey and reported the phenomenon. A USGS scientist named Dr. Patricia Gould reviewed the data remotely and expressed skepticism. She noted that synchronized thermal oscillations across such a large area were inconsistent with known geophysical processes. She recommended additional instrumentation and independent verification. Ramos and Tanaka installed seismometers to detect any mechanical movement in the ground. The seismometers recorded faint vibrations that corresponded with the temperature fluctuations. The vibrations were too small to be felt by hand, but were measurable by sensitive instruments. The ground was moving, expanding slightly as the temperature rose, contracting as it fell. The displacement was less than a millimeter, but it was real, and it was synchronized. Osei calculated the total energy required to produce the observed temperature changes. The amount was small, but non-trivial. If the phenomenon was occurring across the entire 2-mile area, the energy input would be equivalent to several kilowatts, roughly the output of a small generator running continuously. The source of the energy was unknown. There were no power lines in the area, no buried cables, no industrial equipment. The nearest human infrastructure was the abandoned town of Council, 3 miles away. On July 16th, a journalist named Martin Reyes, who had been covering climate research in Alaska, learned about the study through a contact at the university. He traveled to Council and interviewed Vega. She described the phenomenon in general terms, but declined to speculate on its cause. Reyes observed the field site and reviewed some of the data. He wrote an article for an Anchorage-based science magazine, published in August of 2011. The article described the temperature fluctuations as unexplained but scientifically documented and noted that further research was planned. The phenomenon continued through July. The team collected data daily, documenting the pattern without deviation. On July 24th, Winters returned to Council with additional equipment, including magnetometers, to detect any magnetic anomalies. The magnetometers recorded normal readings. The Earth's magnetic field in the area was consistent with expected values for the region. On July 28th, the pattern stopped. Ramos noticed the change during a routine data download. The temperature fluctuations had ceased. The sensors showed stable readings at all depths. Vega checked the other boreholes. All had stopped simultaneously. The 18-second cycle was gone. The ground temperature was once again constant. The team conducted a thorough review of the equipment. The sensors were still functioning. The data from the previous 6 weeks was intact and consistent. The phenomenon had simply ended as abruptly as it had begun. Vega extended the field season into August, hoping the pattern would resume. It did not. The sensors continued to record stable temperatures. The team packed up the equipment in late August and returned to Fairbanks. Vega filed a comprehensive report with the university and the USGS, documenting the observations and the abrupt cessation of the phenomenon. Winters wrote a paper based on the data, submitted to the Journal of Geophysical Research in October of 2011. The paper described the temperature oscillations, the synchronized pattern, and the lack of a clear geophysical explanation. It was peer-reviewed and published in March of 2012. The reviewers acknowledged the rigor of the data collection, but expressed uncertainty about the interpretation. One reviewer suggested the possibility of instrument error, though Winters demonstrated that multiple independent sensors had recorded the same pattern. Another reviewer proposed an unknown subsurface process, but offered no specific mechanism. The paper attracted limited attention within the geophysical community. A few researchers contacted Winters to request additional data. None could offer a satisfactory explanation. The phenomenon was discussed at a conference on Arctic geology in 2013, but no consensus emerged. In 2014, a research team from the University of Tromsø in Norway attempted to replicate the study. They installed similar equipment near Longyearbyen on Svalbard, another permafrost region. They monitored the site for 3 months. No temperature oscillations were observed. A separate team conducted a study in northern Canada in 2015 with the same result. Vega returned to council in the summer of 2016. She reinstalled sensors at several of the original borehole sites and monitored them for 6 weeks. The ground temperatures remained stable. No rhythmic fluctuations were detected. She has not returned since. The data from 2011 remains in the university archives. The paper by Winters is cited occasionally in literature on permafrost dynamics, usually as an unexplained anomaly. No further research has been funded. The boreholes near council have been abandoned, their sensors long since removed or buried by shifting soil. Council is still there, a ghost town slowly sinking into the tundra. The permafrost beneath it is silent now, frozen and still. But for 6 weeks in the summer of 2011, the ground breathed. 18 seconds in, 18 seconds out. A pulse in the earth where no pulse should exist, and no one knows if it will happen again or if it has already stopped forever. Time does not skip, except when it does. Talkeetna sits at the confluence of 3 rivers in south-central Alaska, roughly 115 miles north of Anchorage. The town was established in 1916 as a supply center for gold miners and trappers working the Susitna River Valley. It grew modestly over the decades, serving as a staging point for mountaineers attempting Denali, North America's highest peak, which looms 60 miles to the northwest. By 2007, Talkeetna's year-round population hovered around 800, swelling in summer with climbers, tourists, and seasonal workers. The town retains a frontier character: wood frame buildings along a main street, gravel roads, and a mix of old-timers and newcomers who appreciate the balance between accessibility and isolation. It has electricity, phone service, and internet, but the infrastructure is modest. Most residents know each other. The pace is slow. Events that disrupt routine are noticed immediately. Talkeetna is not remote in the way of bush Alaska, but it sits in a landscape that humbles human presence. The rivers are glacial and cold. The mountains dominate the horizon. The sky is vast. It is the kind of place where nature's indifference is felt daily, but where time, man-made, regulated, dependable, has always functioned as expected. Until August 14, 2007. The event occurred during the early morning hours, when most residents were asleep. The first person to notice was a woman named Janet Kowalczyk, who worked the overnight shift at the Talkeetna Roadhouse, a restaurant and lodge on Main Street. Kowalczyk had been awake since 10 p.m. on August 13th, preparing breakfast supplies and monitoring the quiet dining room. She regularly checked the wall clock behind the counter, a battery-operated unit that had hung there for over a decade. At approximately 2:45 a.m., by her recollection, Kowalczyk glanced at the clock. It read 2:46. She returned to the kitchen to start a pot of coffee. When she came back to the dining room, what felt like a few minutes later, the clock read 5:03 a.m. She assumed she had misread the earlier time or lost track while working. She checked her wristwatch, a digital model. It also read 5:03. She checked her cell phone. 5:03. Kowalczyk felt disoriented, but continued her work. At 5:30, the first customer arrived, a bush pilot named Derek Ryland, who often stopped in for coffee before early flights. Kowalczyk mentioned that the morning had felt strange, that she seemed to have lost track of time. Ryland said he felt the same. He had woken at what he thought was 4 a.m., checked his alarm clock, and seen that it was already past 5. He assumed he had slept through the alarm, but the alarm had not gone off. He checked his phone and his watch. Both confirmed the time. By 6 a.m., more residents began to notice discrepancies. A teacher named Maurice Thibault, who kept a meticulous routine, reported that his bedside clock, an analog wind-up model, showed 5:45 when he woke, but his phone showed the same time. He had gone to bed at 11 p.m. and typically woke at 6. The night had felt normal, but an hour appeared to be missing. A shopkeeper named Irina Volkov, who lived alone on the edge of town, noticed that her kitchen clock had jumped from 3:17 to 5:17. She had been awake briefly around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and distinctly remembered checking the time. When she woke again at what should have been 4:30, the clock read 5:30. She checked 3 other clocks in her house, digital, battery-operated, and plug-in models. All showed 5:30. By mid-morning, the topic dominated conversations in town. Residents compared notes at the post office, the general store, and the roadhouse. The consensus was unsettling. Every clock in Talkeetna, regardless of type or power source, had skipped from approximately 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. No one could recall the missing hour. Those who had been awake, like Kowalczyk, described a sense of disorientation, as though time had compressed or they had experienced a lapse in attention. Those who had been asleep reported nothing unusual, only the discovery upon waking that their clocks had jumped forward. A retired electrician named Bernard Ashford conducted an informal survey. He visited 12 households and documented their clocks. All showed the same pattern, a 1-hour gap occurring sometime between 3 and 4 a.m. Ashford checked his own equipment, battery backups, generators, and electronic devices. All had experienced the same skip. He found no evidence of power surges or outages. The electrical grid, managed by the local cooperative, showed no disruptions in the logs. A resident named Kavita Mehta, who worked in telecommunications, contacted her service provider to inquire about network issues. The provider confirmed that cell towers in the area had operated normally throughout the night. Call records, text logs, and data usage showed no gaps. The network timestamps were continuous. From the perspective of the telecommunications infrastructure, the missing hour had never existed. Mehta mentioned the incident to a colleague in Anchorage, who suggested contacting the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the federal agency responsible for maintaining official time standards. Mehta submitted a query via email on August 15th. She received a response 3 days later. The NIST representative stated that atomic clocks, GPS satellites, and other time reference systems had recorded no anomalies on August 14th. Universal Coordinated Time had proceeded normally. If clocks in Talkeetna had displayed incorrect times, the cause was local, not systemic. Ashford contacted the Alaska Earthquake Center to inquire about seismic activity. A seismologist named Dr. Yolanda Pritchard reviewed the data and confirmed that no earthquakes or unusual geological events had occurred in the region on August 13th or 14th. She noted that electromagnetic disturbances caused by geomagnetic storms could theoretically affect electronic devices, but such events would not impact mechanical clocks, and no solar activity had been recorded during that period. A journalist named Samuel Wu, who freelanced for the Anchorage Daily News, heard about the incident through a friend in Talkeetna. He arrived on August 17th and spent 2 days interviewing residents. Wu spoke with Kowalczyk, Ryland, Thibault, Volkov, and more than 20 others. Their accounts were consistent. The clocks had skipped forward, and no one remembered the missing hour. Wu asked if anyone had been recording video or audio during the night. No one had. He asked if any external systems, weather stations, security cameras, or automated sensors had captured data. The few such systems in town were reviewed, and none showed irregularities. Timestamps in recorded data jumped from approximately 3 a.m. to 5 a.m., matching the clocks. Wu contacted the Federal Aviation Administration to inquire about flight data. Talkeetna's small airport serves bush planes and charter flights, and aircraft flying in the area would have log time via GPS. The FAA provided records for flights passing near Talkeetna on the night of August 13th and the morning of August 14th. The timestamps in the flight logs were continuous. Pilots reported no anomalies. From the perspective of aircraft systems, the missing hour had not occurred. Wu published an article in late August 2007. The piece was titled "Lost Time in Talkeetna" and summarized the residents' accounts and the lack of external confirmation. The article generated brief interest online, with some readers suggesting explanations ranging from mass hallucination to localized electromagnetic phenomena. Wu followed up with several experts. Dr. Leonard Strauss, a physicist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, reviewed the accounts and stated that synchronized clock failure across multiple device types was highly improbable without a common external cause. He noted that mechanical clocks, digital clocks, and battery-operated devices rely on different mechanisms and would not fail identically under normal conditions. He suggested the possibility of a localized geomagnetic pulse, but acknowledged that such an event would likely have been detected by monitoring equipment and would not explain the uniform 1-hour skip. A psychologist named Dr. Margaret Nwosu, specializing in memory and perception, proposed that the residents might have experienced a collective time distortion caused by sleep inertia or circadian disruption. However, she acknowledged that this explanation did not account for the physical evidence the clocks themselves had changed. She noted that witnesses who had been awake, like Kowalczyk, described the event in real time, not as a memory reconstructed after the fact. In September 2007, the National Transportation Safety Board reviewed the incident as part of a broader assessment of timekeeping anomalies in remote areas. Their report, filed in October, concluded that the Talkeetna event was an unexplained local occurrence with no identified safety implications. The report recommended no further action. Wu attempted to follow up in 2008, contacting residents to ask if any similar events had occurred. None had. Kowalczyk confirmed that the roadhouse clocks had functioned normally since August 14th. Ashford stated that he had installed additional monitoring equipment in his home to detect future anomalies, but had recorded nothing unusual. In 2010, a Reddit user posted about the incident, citing Wu's article. The post generated discussion but no new information. A few commenters claimed to have experienced similar events in other locations, but none provided verifiable details or documentation. The thread was archived after a few weeks. Talkeetna continues to operate as it always has. Climbers still stage expeditions to Denali. Tourists visit in summer. The roadhouse serves breakfast. The clocks on the walls tick forward, second by second, marking time as they are designed to do. But on the night of August 14, 2007, something interrupted that progression. For reasons no investigation has clarified, every clock in town lost an hour that the rest of the world insists never went missing. The residents woke to a discrepancy they could measure but not explain. And in the gap between 3 and 5 a.m., in the space where an hour should have been, there is only silence and the uncomfortable certainty that time, for once, refused to be accounted for. Navigation fails where certainty is required most. Donlin Creek lies in the Kuskokwim River region of southwest Alaska, roughly 10 miles north of the village of Crooked Creek and roughly 300 miles west of Anchorage. The area is tundra rolling hills covered in low shrubs, grasses, and sedge, punctuated by shallow streams and seasonal melt ponds. There are no roads. Access is by small aircraft landing on dirt strips or by boat during the ice-free months. The nearest town of any size is Bethel, 90 miles to the southwest. The region has been explored for mineral deposits since the early 1980s, when geologists identified gold concentrations in the bedrock beneath Donlin Creek. Over the following decades, exploration companies conducted surveys, drilled test cores, and evaluated the feasibility of large-scale mining. By 2000, the Donlin Creek project was recognized as one of the largest undeveloped gold deposits in North America. However, the remoteness, lack of infrastructure, and environmental concerns delayed development. By 2013, the site remained in the exploration phase, with periodic field surveys and limited permanent facilities. The landscape is open and featureless in many areas, making navigation critical. Surveyors rely on GPS, compasses, and topographic maps to mark boundaries, locate drill sites, and establish reference points. The terrain offers few natural landmarks. One hillside looks much like another, and fog or low clouds can obscure visibility for days. In July of 2013, a surveying crew employed by a mineral exploration contractor was working in the Donlin Creek area. The crew consisted of 4 people: a lead surveyor named Isaac DuPont, 2 field technicians named Marissa Kovalenko and Thomas Begay, and a geologist named Dr. Priya Sengupta. They were conducting a boundary survey for a proposed drill site, approximately 3 miles northeast of the main exploration camp. On July 9th, the crew was using handheld GPS units and magnetic compasses to establish survey markers. DuPont and Kovalenko were working on opposite ends of a transect line, using compasses to verify directional bearings. At approximately 11 a.m., Kovalenko radioed DuPont and reported that her compass was malfunctioning. The needle was spinning continuously, rotating without stopping or settling on north. She assumed the compass was broken and switched to a backup unit. The second compass behaved identically. DuPont walked to her position, roughly 200 feet away. His compass functioned normally until he reached Kovalenko's location. Once there, his compass needle began to spin. He moved back toward his original position. The spinning stopped, and the needle returned to north. He moved forward again. The spinning resumed. DuPont called Begay and Sengupta to the location. All 4 observed the same phenomenon. Within a specific area, compasses would not function. The needle spun continuously, rotating clockwise at varying speeds but never settling. Outside the area, the compasses worked normally. The boundary appeared to be a circle, with Kovalenko's initial position near the center. The crew spent the next 2 hours mapping the perimeter of the affected area. They walked in widening arcs, noting where the compasses began and stopped spinning. The boundary was consistent and sharply defined. Inside the circle, compasses failed. Outside, they worked. The diameter of the circle was approximately 400 feet. The crew marked the perimeter with flagging tape and recorded GPS coordinates for the center: 62.1 to 4 north, 157.8 to 6 west. Sengupta suggested that the anomaly might be caused by a localized magnetic field, possibly from mineralization in the bedrock or buried ferrous material. She noted that certain geological formations could produce magnetic interference, though she had never encountered anything this pronounced or well-defined. DuPont agreed to report the finding to the project manager and recommended a follow-up survey with specialized equipment. On July 12th, a geophysicist named Dr. Kwame Ofosu arrived at the Donlin Creek camp. Ofosu had been contracted by the exploration company to investigate the anomaly. He brought a proton magnetometer, an instrument used to measure the strength and direction of magnetic fields. On July 13th, Ofosu and the surveying crew returned to the site. Ofosu conducted a systematic survey of the area, taking magnetometer readings at intervals of 50 feet. He measured the magnetic field strength inside and outside the circle. The readings were normal. The Earth's magnetic field in the area was consistent with expected values for the region, approximately 55,000 nanoteslas, typical for that latitude. There was no detectable anomaly. The magnetometer showed no difference between the interior and exterior of the circle. Ofosu was puzzled. Magnetic compasses rely on the Earth's magnetic field to orient themselves. If the field was normal, the compasses should function normally. He tested multiple compasses inside the circle. All spun continuously. He tested an electronic compass, a digital device that uses magnetoresistive sensors, rather than a floating needle. The electronic compass also failed, displaying erratic readings and unable to lock onto a heading. Ofosu examined the ground for signs of buried metal or ferrous deposits. He used a metal detector and found nothing significant. A few small fragments of rusted equipment, likely left by previous exploration crews, but nothing large enough to cause widespread magnetic interference. He collected soil samples and rock samples from the center of the circle and sent them to a laboratory in Anchorage for analysis. The laboratory results, returned in early August, showed no unusual mineral content. The soil and rock were typical of the region's sedimentary deposits, with trace amounts of iron, copper, and other common elements. The iron content was not sufficient to create a strong magnetic field. The lab director, a geochemist named Dr. Helena Varga, reviewed the findings and stated that the samples did not explain the compass behavior. Ofosu returned to the site on August 17th with additional equipment, including a GPS receiver capable of recording precise positional data. He wanted to determine if the GPS signals were also affected. He found that GPS units worked normally inside the circle. Satellite positioning was accurate and stable. The anomaly affected only magnetic navigation, not electronic positioning systems that rely on satellite signals. Ofosu documented his findings in a report submitted to the exploration company in September of 2013. He concluded that the circle exhibited a localized compass anomaly of unknown origin. The magnetic field measurements were normal, suggesting that the interference was not caused by a conventional magnetic source. He recommended further study but noted that the anomaly did not pose a safety risk, as GPS navigation remained functional. The exploration company forwarded the report to the United States Geological Survey. A USGS scientist named Dr. Raymond Kowalski reviewed the documentation and expressed interest in the case. In October, Kowalski contacted Ofosu and requested permission to visit the site. The exploration company granted access, and Kowalski traveled to Donlin Creek in late October, accompanied by a field assistant named Emily Trudeau. Kowalski repeated the compass tests and confirmed the anomaly. He brought a fluxgate magnetometer, a more sensitive instrument than the proton magnetometer Ofosu had used. The flux gate readings were also normal. Kowalski tested for electromagnetic interference using a spectrum analyzer, checking for radio frequency emissions or electrical fields that might disrupt the compasses. He found none. The area was electromagnetically quiet. Kowalski conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey to detect subsurface structures or voids that might explain the phenomenon. The radar showed normal soil and bedrock profiles. There were no cavities, no buried objects, and no unusual formations. Kowalski collected additional samples and returned to his office in Anchorage. In December of 2013, Kowalski published a brief technical note in a USGS bulletin describing the Donlin Creek compass anomaly. The note summarized the observations, the lack of a detectable magnetic source, and the sharp boundary of the affected area. He suggested several hypotheses: residual magnetization in the bedrock, localized ionospheric effects, or an unknown interaction between the Earth's magnetic field and subsurface materials. None of the hypotheses were supported by the data. The note concluded with a recommendation for continued monitoring. The exploration company did not pursue further investigation. The site was located outside the primary drilling areas, and the anomaly did not interfere with operations. The flagging tape marking the perimeter was left in place, but no additional surveys were conducted. In 2015, a graduate student named Julian Mercer, studying geophysics at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, learned about the anomaly through Kowalski's technical note. Mercer contacted OFOSU and requested access to the raw data. Mercer analyzed the magnetometer readings and GPS coordinates, looking for patterns or correlations. He found none. The circle was geometrically precise, but there was no obvious explanation for its existence. Mercer visited the site in June of 2015. He brought additional compasses and electronic navigation devices. All failed inside the circle. He attempted to map the boundary with greater precision using a total station surveying instrument. The boundary was consistent with the original measurements. A circle with a diameter of 400 feet, centered on the same GPS coordinates. Mercer noted that the circle had not shifted or changed in the 2 years since its discovery. Mercer wrote his master's thesis on the anomaly, submitted in 2016. The thesis reviewed all available data and proposed that the phenomenon might be related to crustal conductivity variations or localized geomagnetic micropulsations. He acknowledged that neither explanation was fully satisfactory. The thesis was filed in the university archives and did not attract significant attention. In 2018, OFOSU returned to the Donlin Creek area as part of an unrelated geological survey. He visited the compass anomaly site out of curiosity. The flagging tape was gone, degraded by weather, but the GPS coordinates were unchanged. He tested a compass. It spun. The anomaly persisted. No further investigations have been conducted. The site remains accessible but rarely visited. The exploration company continues to evaluate the Donlin Creek gold deposit, but the compass anomaly lies outside the active work area. The land is managed by the state of Alaska and is open to the public, though few people travel to such a remote location. The circle is still there, 400 feet in diameter, centered on 62.1 to 4 north, 157.8 to 6 west. A place where compasses lose their purpose and spin without direction. The Earth's magnetic field passes through it, measurable and normal. Yet something in that ground refuses to let the needles point north. And no one knows if it has always been there, waiting to be found, or if it arrived one day and decided to stay. Some places remember what was said before they disappeared. Portage was a railroad town on the eastern shore of Turnagain Arm, roughly 50 miles southeast of Anchorage. Established in 1906 during the construction of the Alaska Railroad, it served as a stop for passengers and freight traveling between Seward and Anchorage. By the 1950s, Portage had a population of roughly 70 people, a school, a post office, and a small cemetery on a rise overlooking the rail line. The town was modest, functional, and unremarkable, a waypoint in a landscape dominated by mountains, glaciers, and tidal flats. On March 27, 1964, the Good Friday earthquake struck south-central Alaska. The quake, measuring 9.2 on the Richter scale, remains one of the most powerful ever recorded. The ground shook for over 4 minutes. In Portage, the land subsided by nearly 6 feet. Tidal surges from Turnagain Arm flooded the town site. Salt water infiltrated the soil, killing vegetation and rendering the area uninhabitable. The residents evacuated. The railroad rerouted its tracks. Portage was abandoned. Today, the town site is part of the Chugach National Forest. The buildings are gone, collapsed or removed. The land is marsh and tidal flat, overgrown with grasses and willows. The cemetery remains on the rise, though most of the headstones have sunk or tilted into the unstable ground. A few wooden markers are still visible, weathered and illegible. The area is accessible by a short trail from the Seward Highway. Hikers visit occasionally, drawn by the history or the views of Portage Glacier in the distance. On June 18, 2009, a hiker named Eli Mbatha visited the Portage Cemetery. Mbatha was a history teacher from Anchorage who had an interest in Alaska's railroad-era towns. He had read about Portage and wanted to see the site. He arrived in the late afternoon and walked through the cemetery, photographing the headstones and the surrounding landscape. While standing near the center of the cemetery, Mbatha spoke aloud, narrating his observations for a voice recording he was making on his phone. He mentioned the 1964 earthquake and described the condition of the graves. Approximately 15 seconds after he finished speaking, he heard his own voice repeating his words. The echo was clear and distinct, as though someone had played back a recording. Mbatha stopped and listened. The echo continued until his original statement had been fully repeated, then fell silent. Mbatha assumed the sound was an acoustic phenomenon, perhaps a reflection off the nearby mountains or trees. He spoke again, this time a simple sentence. "This is a test." He waited. No echo returned. He repeated the sentence. Still nothing. He then said, "The earthquake in 1964 destroyed this town." 15 seconds later, his voice returned, repeating the sentence exactly. Mbatha experimented for the next 20 minutes. He found that only certain phrases produced the echo. Statements about the earthquake, the town's history, or the people buried in the cemetery would return after 15 seconds. Generic statements or unrelated topics produced no echo. He recorded several examples on his phone and left the site, unsettled but curious. Mbatha shared the recordings with a colleague, a physics teacher named Dr. Fatima Jaber. Jaber listened to the audio and noted the clarity of the echoes. She suggested that Mbatha return to the site with better recording equipment. On June 25, 2009, Mbatha and Jaber visited the cemetery together, bringing a directional microphone and a digital recorder. They repeated the experiments. Jaber spoke a sentence about the weather. No echo. She spoke about the earthquake. 15 seconds later, her voice returned. Mbatha asked a question about a specific name on one of the headstones. Who was buried here in 1953? The echo returned, repeating the question. Jaber spoke a sentence in Arabic. No echo. She translated the sentence into English, describing the cemetery. The echo returned. Jaber and Mbatha walked the perimeter of the cemetery, testing the phenomenon at different locations. The echo occurred consistently within the cemetery boundaries, but not outside them. Jaber measured the distance to the nearest reflective surfaces, trees, hillsides, and structures. The closest significant surface was a line of spruce trees, approximately 300 feet away. She calculated the time required for sound to travel to the trees and back. At the speed of sound, the round trip would take roughly half a second, not 15 seconds. Jaber contacted a colleague at the University of Alaska Anchorage, an acoustics researcher named Dr. William Novak. Novak reviewed the recordings and agreed to visit the site. On July 3, 2009, Novak, Jaber, and Mbatha returned to the cemetery with professional acoustic measurement equipment. Novak conducted a series of tests. He used a speaker to emit calibrated tones and measured the reflections. The acoustic environment was typical of an open, flat area, minimal reverberation, no significant echoes. He recorded ambient sound levels and found them consistent with a quiet outdoor setting. He then asked Mbatha to repeat the phrases that had produced echoes during the earlier visits. The echoes returned, captured clearly on Novak's equipment. Novak analyzed the recordings in his laboratory. The echoes were not simple reflections. A standard acoustic echo occurs when sound waves bounce off a surface and return to the source. The time delay depends on the distance to the reflective surface. In the Portage Cemetery, there were no surfaces at the distance required to produce a 15-second delay. The nearest mountains were over a mile away, which would produce a delay of approximately 10 seconds under ideal conditions, and the terrain did not support such reflections. More troubling, the echoes were selective. Novak tested dozens of phrases. Only statements related to the town's history, the earthquake, or the cemetery itself produced echoes. Unrelated statements, even when spoken with the same volume and clarity, produced no response. Novak could not identify a physical mechanism that would account for this selectivity. In August of 2009, Novak published a brief paper in an acoustics journal describing the phenomenon as an anomalous delayed auditory reflection. The paper included spectrograms of the recordings and noted the absence of conventional reflective surfaces. Novak concluded that the echoes could not be explained by standard acoustic principles and recommended further study. The paper attracted limited attention. A few researchers contacted Novak for additional data, but none proposed a satisfactory explanation. A geophysicist named Dr. Omar Petrov suggested that subsurface voids or cavities might act as resonant chambers, storing and releasing sound energy. Novak returned to the site in September and conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys. The surveys revealed no voids or unusual subsurface structures. The ground was saturated soil and sediment, typical of a post-earthquake subsidence zone. In 2010, a paranormal investigator named Claire DeRossi visited the cemetery after reading about Novak's findings online. DeRossi conducted her own experiments, recording hours of audio. She reported similar results. Echoes occurred only when speaking about the town's past. DeRossi's recordings were uploaded to a website focused on unexplained phenomena, where they generated discussion, but no new insights. In 2012, a journalist named Hiroshi Tanaka, writing for an Anchorage-based magazine, interviewed Novak, Jaber, and Mbatha. Tanaka visited the cemetery and experienced the echoes firsthand. His article, published in October of 2012, summarized the findings and noted the lack of scientific explanation. The article included links to audio recordings and encouraged readers to visit the site. Following the article's publication, the cemetery saw an increase in visitors. Many reported hearing the echoes. A few recorded them and shared the audio online. The recordings were consistent with earlier findings: 15-second delays, selective response to historical statements, no conventional acoustic explanation. In 2014, the United States Forest Service, which manages the Chugach National Forest, received inquiries about the cemetery. A spokesperson stated that the site was open to the public and that the Forest Service had no explanation for the reported acoustic phenomena. No restrictions were placed on access. Novak returned to the site in 2015 with updated equipment, including laser rangefinders and high-resolution audio recorders. He repeated his earlier experiments and obtained the same results. He measured air temperature, humidity, and wind speed, looking for atmospheric conditions that might explain the echoes. The conditions were normal and did not correlate with the occurrence of the echoes. In 2016, a linguist named Dr. Keiko Yamamoto reviewed the recordings and noted that the echoes reproduced not only the words, but also the intonation and pacing of the original speech. This level of fidelity suggested that the echoes were not distorted reflections, but precise reproductions. Yamamoto could offer no mechanism for how this might occur naturally. In 2018, Mbatha returned to the cemetery for the first time since 2009. He brought a group of students from his history class. He spoke about the earthquake and the town's abandonment. The echoes returned, just as they had 9 years earlier. The students recorded the phenomenon on their phones. Several later described the experience as unsettling, though none could articulate exactly why. The cemetery remains accessible. The trail from the highway is maintained, and the site is marked on maps. Visitors continue to report the echoes, and recordings continue to be shared online. No new scientific studies have been conducted. The phenomenon persists, unexplained and unresolved. The land where Portage once stood is quiet now, reclaimed by tides and grasses. The cemetery on the rise is the only remnant of the town, a scattering of tilted stones marking lives that ended before the earthquake, before the town sank and vanished. And in that place, voices spoken today return 15 seconds later, carrying the weight of words that should have faded into the air, but somehow do not. The echoes are patient, precise, and selective. They answer only when asked about the past, and no one has determined whether they are reflections of sound or something that listens first, then decides what deserves to be repeated. Precision can be more disturbing than chaos when it appears without reason. Umnak Island lies in the eastern Aleutian chain, roughly 60 miles southwest of Unalaska. It is the third largest island in the Aleutians, stretching 40 miles long and 15 miles wide at its widest point. The landscape is volcanic, dominated by Mount Okmok, an active caldera that last erupted in 2008. The island is treeless, covered in tundra grasses and low shrubs, swept by constant wind. The coastline is rugged, with steep cliffs and rocky beaches offering few protected anchorages. Umnak has no permanent settlements. The Aleut people inhabited the island for thousands of years, but the population was devastated by disease and displacement during the Russian colonial period. A small community existed at Nikolsky, on the island's southwest coast, until the mid-20th century. But by 2009, the village consisted of fewer than 30 residents. The island is part of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. The surrounding waters are rich fishing grounds, and commercial vessels frequently work the area during the summer months. The Bering Sea and the North Pacific meet near Umnak, creating unpredictable weather and strong currents. Fishermen who work these waters are experienced and cautious. They monitor weather forecasts closely, maintain their equipment rigorously, and adhere to established safety protocols. The area is remote, but it is not mysterious. It is a working sea, governed by weather, tides, and the behavior of fish. On the night of August 9th, 2009, 3 commercial fishing vessels were anchored in separate locations around Umnak Island. The vessels, the Northern Star, the Pacific Endurance, and the Kodiak Wind, were part of the summer pollock and cod fishery. They had been working independently and were anchored for the night in sheltered bays along the island's eastern and southern coasts. The Northern Star was anchored in Inanudak Bay on the eastern shore. The crew consisted of 5 people, including the captain, a man named Vincent LaRoche. The vessel carried standard navigation equipment, radios, and depth sounders. Several crew members wore mechanical wristwatches, self-winding or manual wind models, favored by those who work on water, as they are more reliable than battery-powered devices in harsh conditions. On the morning of August 10th, LaRoche noticed that his watch had stopped. The hands were frozen at 2:47. He wound the watch, and it resumed running normally. He mentioned it to his first mate, a man named Takumi Saito, who checked his own watch and found that it had also stopped at 2:47. A deckhand named Rosa Delgado reported the same. All 3 watches had stopped at the same time during the night. LaRoche assumed the stoppage was coincidental or caused by a vibration in the vessel. He noted it in the ship's log, but did not consider it significant. The Northern Star resumed fishing operations later that morning. That same morning, aboard the Pacific Endurance, anchored in Stepovac Bay on the southern coast, the captain, a woman named Margaret O'Sullivan, discovered that her watch had stopped at 2:47 a.m. She mentioned it to her crew. Two deckhands, Felipe Ruiz and Astrid Bjornson, checked their watches. Both had stopped at the same time. O'Sullivan found the coincidence odd, but assumed it was related to the ship's engine vibrations or some other mechanical factor. On the Kodiak Wind, anchored in Driftwood Bay on the southeast coast, the captain, a man named Jerome Whitfield, made a similar discovery. His watch and the watches of 3 crew members had all stopped at 2:47 a.m. Whitfield noted the time and mentioned it over the radio to another vessel working nearby. The other vessel reported no issues with their watches. The 3 vessels remained in the area, continuing their work. On the night of August 10th, all 3 anchored again in the same general locations. The following morning, August 11th, crew members aboard all 3 vessels discovered that their watches had stopped again and had resumed running again at exactly 2:47 a.m. LaRoche aboard the Northern Star reviewed his watch carefully. It had been running normally throughout August 10th. At some point during the night of August 10th, it had stopped at 2:47. Then, at 2:47 on the morning of August 11th, it had resumed running without any intervention. The watch had not been touched. It had simply started again on its own, exactly 24 hours after it had stopped. O'Sullivan and Whitfield reported identical experiences. Every mechanical watch on all 3 vessels had stopped at 2:47 a.m. on August 10th and resumed at 2:47 a.m. on August 11th. Digital watches and battery-powered devices were unaffected. Radios, GPS units, and electronic depth sounders functioned normally. Only mechanical watches devices that rely on gears, springs, and balance wheels had been affected. LaRoche contacted the Coast Guard station in Dutch Harbor and reported the incident. The Coast Guard operator logged the report and asked if the vessels were experiencing any other equipment malfunctions. LaRoche stated that all other systems were functioning normally. The operator suggested the possibility of a magnetic anomaly or electromagnetic interference, though such phenomena typically affected electronic devices, not mechanical watches. O'Sullivan contacted a marine electrician she knew in Unalaska, a man named Derek Mullen. Mullen had 30 years of experience with shipboard electrical systems. O'Sullivan described the watch stoppages. Mullen stated that mechanical watches could be affected by strong magnetic fields, which could magnetize the balance spring and cause erratic timekeeping. However, such magnetization would not cause all watches to stop simultaneously at a precise time, nor would it cause them to restart simultaneously 24 hours later. On August 12th, the 3 vessels rendezvoused near Umnak Island to compare notes. The captains and crew members gathered aboard the Northern Star. They collected all the affected watches, 26 in total, and documented their conditions. All were mechanical, ranging from inexpensive manual wind models to high-end automatic chronometers. None showed signs of damage. All had resumed normal operation after the second 2:47 occurrence. LaRoche contacted a watchmaker in Seattle named Dr. Helena Voss, who specialized in mechanical timepieces. LaRoche described the incident and asked if Voss had ever encountered similar behavior. Voss stated that simultaneous stoppage and restart of multiple mechanical watches was highly unusual. She suggested sending several watches to her for examination. On August 15th, LaRoche mailed 3 watches to Voss, one from his vessel, one from the Pacific Endurance, and one from the Kodiak Wind. Voss examined them in her workshop and found no abnormalities. The movements were clean, properly lubricated, and functioning within normal tolerances. She tested each watch for magnetization using a demagnetizer and found no residual magnetic fields. She ran the watches continuously for 2 weeks. They kept accurate time. Voss contacted a colleague, a physicist named Dr. Omar Khalid, who had published research on the effects of electromagnetic fields on mechanical systems. Khalid reviewed the incident report and the watch examination findings. He stated that mechanical watches could theoretically be affected by external fields, but the precision and synchronization described in the incident were inconsistent with known physical mechanisms. Magnetic fields strong enough to stop a mechanical watch would likely affect other metal objects on the vessels. No such effects had been reported. The Coast Guard forwarded the incident report to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which monitors geophysical phenomena in Alaskan waters. A NOAA scientist named Dr. Patricia Gould reviewed the report and checked for recorded magnetic storms or solar activity on August 9th and 10th. The data showed normal conditions. The Earth's magnetic field had been stable. There were no recorded geomagnetic disturbances in the Aleutian region during that period. Gould also reviewed seismic data from the Alaska Earthquake Information Center. Mount Okmok on Umnak Island is an active volcano, and seismic activity can sometimes produce electromagnetic signals. The seismic data showed low-level background activity, typical for the region, but no significant events on August 9th or 10th. In September of 2009, a journalist named Samuel Trudeau, who covered maritime stories for an Alaskan trade publication, learned about the incident through a contact in Dutch Harbor. Trudeau interviewed LaRoche, O'Sullivan, and Whitfield by phone. All confirmed the details. Trudeau requested access to the ship logs and photographs of the watches. The captains provided both. Trudeau published an article in October of 2009. The article, titled "Mystery of the Stopped Watches," summarized the incident and noted the lack of a scientific explanation. The article was picked up by a few national outlets and circulated online. It generated interest, but no new information. In 2010, a researcher named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who studied chronometry and timekeeping devices at the University of Tokyo, read Trudeau's article and contacted LaRoche. Tanaka requested detailed information about the makes and models of the affected watches. LaRoche provided a list. Tanaka noted that the watches represented a variety of manufacturers and movement types: Swiss, Japanese, Russian with different escapement designs and balance wheel configurations. The diversity made a common mechanical failure even less likely. Tanaka proposed that the watches might have been affected by infrasound low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. Infrasound can be generated by natural sources, such as ocean waves, wind, or seismic activity. Tanaka suggested that infrasound at a specific frequency might resonate with the balance wheels of mechanical watches, causing them to stop. However, Tanaka acknowledged that this hypothesis did not explain the precise timing or the synchronized restart. In 2011, Whitfield sold the Kodiak Wind and retired from fishing. Before selling the vessel, he removed his watch, the one that had stopped and restarted near Umnak, and placed it in storage. He never wore it again. He told a friend that the watch felt wrong, though he could not explain why. The watch kept accurate time, but Whitfield no longer trusted it. O'Sullivan continued to fish in Aleutian waters. She returned to Umnak Island several times in subsequent years. Her watch, and the watches of her crew, never experienced another stoppage. She mentioned the 2009 incident in interviews, but declined to speculate on its cause. LaRoche left commercial fishing in 2012 and moved to Kodiak. He kept the watch he had worn during the incident. In 2015, he donated it to a maritime museum in Seattle, along with a written account of the event. The watch is displayed in a small exhibit on unexplained maritime phenomena. The placard notes the incident, but offers no explanation. No similar events have been reported in the waters around Umnak Island or elsewhere in the Aleutians. The three vessels have long since moved on. sold, or retired. The 26 watches have scattered, some kept, some discarded, some forgotten. And in the files of the Coast Guard and NOAA, a single report remains, documenting a night when time stopped at 2:47 and resumed exactly 24 hours later, for no reason anyone has been able to determine. Some provisions are replaced by hands that leave no evidence of ever being there. Central Alaska sits along the Steese Highway, roughly 130 miles northeast of Fairbanks. The town was established during the gold rush of the late 1800s, when prospectors flooded the region searching for placer deposits along Crooked Creek and the surrounding drainages. At its peak, Central supported several thousand residents. By 2000, the year-round population had dropped to fewer than 100. The town serves as a supply point for miners, trappers, and seasonal workers who still operate in the area. The surrounding landscape is boreal forest and tundra low hills covered in black spruce, birch, and willow, interspersed with wetlands and muskeg. Winters are severe, with temperatures dropping to -50 degrees. Summers are brief and intense, with 24-hour daylight in June. The region is remote, but not inaccessible. The Steese Highway provides a gravel road connection to Fairbanks, though it is often impassable in winter. The Bureau of Land Management oversees much of the public land in the area, managing mining claims, recreational access, and wilderness safety. In 1998, the BLM established a series of emergency survival caches along remote trails and mining roads in the interior. The caches were designed to provide shelter and supplies for travelers caught in emergencies, stranded hikers, broken-down vehicles, or individuals lost in bad weather. Each cache was a weatherproof metal box, approximately 4 feet long by 2 feet wide, anchored to the ground or mounted on a post. The contents typically included emergency rations, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, fire-starting materials, a space blanket, and a hand-crank radio. The caches were inspected and restocked annually by BLM field staff. One cache, designated Cache 17, was installed in 2000 along an unmarked trail roughly 12 miles northwest of Central. The trail was used occasionally by miners and trappers accessing claims in the area, but it saw limited traffic. The cache was placed near a prominent rock outcrop that served as a landmark. The location was recorded with GPS coordinates: 65.5 to 1 north, 144.8 to 7 west. In June of 2001, a BLM ranger named Victor Ashford conducted a routine inspection of Cache 17. Ashford had been with the BLM for 15 years and was familiar with the maintenance schedule. He hiked to the site, unlocked the cache, and found that the contents had been replaced. The emergency rations, which had been set to expire in 2002, were gone. In their place were fresh rations with expiration dates in 2006. The first aid kit had been restocked, the space blanket was new. The hand-crank radio, which had been an older model, had been replaced with a newer unit. Ashford assumed that another BLM staff member had visited the cache ahead of schedule. He radioed the field office in Fairbanks and asked if anyone had conducted an early inspection. The office confirmed that no other personnel had been assigned to the site. Ashford documented the restocking in his field notes and returned to Central. The incident was mentioned in a quarterly report, but not investigated further. In September of 2003, Ashford returned to Cache 17 for another scheduled inspection. The contents had been replaced again. The rations now had expiration dates in 2008. The first aid supplies were fresh. A new tarp had been added. Ashford checked the lock on the cache. It was intact and showed no signs of tampering. He contacted the BLM office and requested clarification. The office confirmed that no restocking had been authorized or conducted by BLM staff since Ashford's last visit. Ashford filed a formal report. The BLM district manager a woman named Margaret Kowalski, reviewed the documentation and decided to install a motion-activated camera at the site. In October of 2003, Ashford returned to Cache 17 and mounted a trail camera on a tree, approximately 30 feet from the cache. The camera was set to record any motion within its field of view and was powered by lithium batteries rated for cold weather operation. In April of 2004, Ashford retrieved the camera's memory card. The footage showed wildlife moose, foxes, and ravens, but no human activity. He inspected the cache. The contents had been replaced again. The rations now expired in 2009. Ashford reinstalled the camera with fresh batteries and a new memory card. In November of 2004, he retrieved the camera again. The footage showed only static for a period of approximately 6 hours on September 23rd. Before and after that period, the camera functioned normally, recording animals and changes in light. During the 6-hour gap, the cache had been restocked. Ashford noted the anomaly in his report and recommended a more robust monitoring system. In 2005, the BLM installed a second camera at the site, positioned at a different angle. Both cameras were checked in May of 2006. The footage from both showed static during an 8-hour period on March 14th. The cache had been restocked. The supplies now included items that had not been part of the original inventory: waterproof matches in sealed containers, high-calorie energy bars, and a compact satellite emergency beacon. Kowalski contacted a security consultant named Derek Mullen, who specialized in remote site monitoring. Mullen visited Cache 17 in July of 2006 and examined the cameras. He found no evidence of tampering or electronic interference. He tested the cameras in the field and confirmed they were functioning correctly. Mullen suggested that the static might be caused by electromagnetic interference from an unknown source, though he noted that such interference would typically affect other electronic devices in the area. Ashford reported that his GPS unit and radio had functioned normally during his visits. In 2007, Mullen installed a third camera with a different recording system, a unit that stored footage on a hard drive rather than a memory card. The camera was enclosed in a weatherproof housing and positioned to cover the cache from a concealed location. In December of 2007, Ashford retrieved the hard drive. The footage showed static during a 12-hour period on October 5th. The cache had been restocked. The supplies now included items not typically found in survival caches: a handwritten note providing instructions for operating the satellite beacon printed on laminated cardstock. Ashford photographed the note and submitted it to the BLM office. The handwriting was neat and legible. The note provided step-by-step instructions, including frequency settings and activation procedures. Kowalski forwarded the note to a forensic document examiner, who determined that the paper and ink were commercially available and provided no identifying information. No fingerprints were recovered from the laminated surface. In 2008, the BLM decided to conduct a stakeout. Ashford and a colleague, a ranger named Lucia Moreno, camped near Cache 17 during late September, when previous restocking events had occurred. They remained at the site for 10 days, observing the cache from a concealed position approximately 100 yards away. They saw no one approach the cache. On the night of September 27th, both rangers reported experiencing a period of disorientation lasting approximately 2 hours, during which they could not recall their actions or observations. When they returned to the cache the following morning, the contents had been replaced. Ashford and Moreno submitted detailed reports describing the disorientation. Both were evaluated by a medical professional in Fairbanks, who found no evidence of illness, injury, or substance exposure. Kowalski recommended discontinuing the stakeout. In 2009, a journalist named Samuel Reyes, who covered environmental and public lands issues, heard about the cache from a contact at the BLM. Reyes requested access to the incident reports under the Freedom of Information Act. He received a summary of the events but was told that certain details, including the exact GPS coordinates, were withheld for security reasons. Reyes visited Central and interviewed Ashford, who confirmed the basic facts but declined to speculate on the cause. Reyes published an article in an outdoor recreation magazine in March of 2010. The article described the restocking events and the failed attempts to identify the responsible party. The article generated moderate interest, but no new leads. A few readers suggested that the restocking was being conducted by a local resident or group performing an unofficial public service. Ashford noted in a follow-up interview that the area around Cache 17 was extremely remote, with no cabins or structures within 10 miles. Winter access would require snowmobile or skis, and the restocking events had occurred in conditions that left no tracks. In 2012, the BLM installed a cellular-connected camera at the site, a unit capable of transmitting images in real time via satellite link. The camera was monitored remotely from the Fairbanks office. In August of 2012, the camera transmitted normal images for 3 days, then went offline for 14 hours. When connectivity resumed, the cache had been restocked. The camera showed no images from the offline period. Technicians examined the unit and found no faults. In 2014, the BLM decided to discontinue active monitoring of Cache 17. Kowalski stated in an internal memo that the cache was providing a valuable service, keeping supplies fresh and available for emergencies, and that further investigation was not cost-effective. The memo recommended that the cache be inspected annually, but that no additional resources be devoted to identifying the restocking party. Ashford retired from the BLM in 2016. In his final field report, he noted that Cache 17 had been restocked 8 times since 2001, always during periods when monitoring equipment failed or observers were incapacitated. He stated that the supplies were always high quality, appropriate for the location, and properly maintained. He concluded that whoever was restocking the cache had detailed knowledge of wilderness survival and access to the site under conditions that left no physical evidence. In 2018, a hiker named Gregory Voss became stranded near the cache after his snowmobile broke down in late March. Voss reached Cache 17 and used the supplies to survive 2 nights in negative 30-degree weather. He was rescued by a search party on the 3rd day. Voss later stated that the supplies had been fresh and well organized. He noted that the emergency beacon in the cache had functioned perfectly and had likely saved his life. The cache remains in place. The BLM conducts annual inspections but no longer monitors it continuously. Ashford's successor, a ranger named Isabel Tran, has documented 2 additional restocking events since 2016. The pattern continues. The supplies are replaced. The cameras fail. The snow reveals no tracks. And no one has ever seen who comes in the night to ensure that Cache 17 is always ready for the next person who needs it. Some warnings are carved by those who know what has not yet happened. Cape Krusenstern National Monument occupies the northwest coast of Alaska, roughly 10 miles north of the village of Kotzebue. The monument protects 114 beach ridges that stretch inland from the Chukchi Sea, each ridge representing a former coastline abandoned as the land built seaward over thousands of years. The oldest ridges, farthest from the ocean, date back 9,000 years. The site contains one of the most complete archaeological records in the Arctic, documenting continuous human occupation from the end of the last ice age to the present. The Inupiat people have lived in this region for millennia. The beach ridges contain evidence of their camps, hunting sites, and seasonal movements. Stone tools, fire pits, and animal bones mark the locations where families gathered, processed food, and survived the long winters. The National Park Service manages the monument, which was established in 1980. Access is difficult, there are no roads, and visitors must travel by boat or small aircraft. Researchers come occasionally to conduct surveys, but the area remains largely undisturbed. Among the archaeological features are petroglyphs, images carved into stone outcrops along the ridges. The carvings depict animals, human figures, and abstract symbols. They are scattered across the monument, some located near ancient dwelling sites, others in isolated locations with no obvious connection to habitation. The petroglyphs are fragile, exposed to wind, salt spray, and freeze-thaw cycles that slowly erode the stone. Park Service policy prohibits touching or altering the carvings, and visitors are instructed to photograph them without physical contact. In July of 2015, a team of archaeologists from the University of Alaska Fairbanks conducted a survey of petroglyphs in the southern section of the monument. The team consisted of 3 people: Dr. Annette Vega, an archaeologist specializing in Arctic prehistory; Dr. Omar Khalid, a geologist; and a graduate student named Julian Mbatha. They were documenting the condition of known petroglyph sites and searching for previously unrecorded carvings. On July 14th, the team visited a site designated as Panel 12, located on a limestone outcrop approximately 3 miles inland from the current coastline. Panel 12 contained 11 carvings, all documented in previous surveys conducted in 1992 and 2003. The carvings depicted caribou, seals, and human figures in the characteristic style of the region, simple outlines with minimal detail, pecked into the rock using stone tools. While photographing the panel, Mbatha noticed a carving that did not appear in the archival records. The image was located on the lower right corner of the outcrop, partially obscured by lichen. It depicted a human figure with outstretched arms, surrounded by what appeared to be circular symbols. The style matched the other carvings on the panel, but Mbatha could not recall seeing it in the documentation. Vega examined the carving and confirmed that it was not present in the earlier surveys. She compared her photographs to the archived images from 2003. The new carving occupied a space that had been blank in the earlier photographs. Vega documented the discovery with detailed images and measurements. She noted that the carving appeared weathered, with a patina similar to the surrounding ancient petroglyphs. On July 16th, the team visited another site, Panel 7, located approximately 2 miles east of Panel 12. Panel 7 had been documented in 1986 and contained 8 carvings. The team found an additional carving, a series of linear marks arranged in a grid pattern that did not appear in the archival records. Again, the style and weathering matched the ancient carvings. Vega reported the findings to the National Park Service office in Kotzebue. A park archaeologist named Derek Sokoloff reviewed the documentation and expressed concern. New carvings on protected sites could indicate vandalism or unauthorized activity. Sokoloff requested that the team collect samples for analysis. On July 18th, Khalid used a portable microscope to examine the surfaces of the new carvings. He observed tool marks consistent with metal implements' fine parallel grooves that suggested the use of a chisel or similar instrument. Ancient petroglyphs in the region were created using stone tools, which leave irregular, crushed marks rather than clean grooves. Khalid photographed the tool marks and collected microscopic samples of the rock surface. The team returned to Fairbanks in late July. Khalid submitted the samples to a laboratory for chemical analysis. The results, returned in August, showed that the carved surfaces contained trace amounts of iron oxide and other compounds consistent with modern steel tools. The patina, the weathered surface layer that gives the carvings their aged appearance, was composed of natural minerals, but the rate of patina formation suggested that the carvings were less than 10 years old, not thousands. Vega contacted a conservation scientist named Dr. Helena Novak, who specialized in rock art preservation. Novak reviewed the analysis and photographs. She stated that the patina on the new carvings had been artificially induced. Natural patina forms slowly, through chemical reactions between the rock surface and environmental factors, such as moisture, temperature, and biological growth. The patina on the Cape Krusenstern carvings showed characteristics consistent with accelerated aging, possibly achieved through chemical treatments or controlled environmental exposure. Novak noted that such techniques were known in the field of art, conservation, and forensic archaeology, used to study weathering processes or to restore damaged artifacts. However, the precision and authenticity of the Cape Krusenstern carvings suggested a level of expertise beyond typical amateur forgery. Whoever created the carvings had detailed knowledge of ancient artistic styles, tool techniques, and weathering processes. In September of 2015, the National Park Service opened an investigation. Sokolov and a law enforcement ranger named Patricia Langford visited the sites. They documented the new carvings and searched the surrounding areas for evidence of recent human activity, footprints, discarded tools, camping sites. They found nothing. The ground around the panels was rocky and covered in lichen, making it difficult to detect disturbances. Langford interviewed residents of Kotzebue and nearby villages, asking if anyone had knowledge of the carvings or had visited the sites recently. No one reported seeing unusual activity. She contacted local cultural organizations and elders, who expressed concern about the possibility of vandalism at a sacred site. Several elders stated that the petroglyphs were created by ancestors and should not be altered or replicated. In October, the Park Service contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which has jurisdiction over crimes on federal land. An FBI agent named Gregory Stavros reviewed the case and determined that it did not meet the threshold for federal prosecution without identifying a suspect or demonstrating intent to defraud. Stavros recommended that the Park Service continue monitoring the sites and report any additional discoveries. In November of 2015, Vega returned to Cape Krusenstern with Mbatha to conduct a comprehensive survey of all known petroglyph sites in the monument. They documented 5 additional new carvings at 3 different panels. All showed the same characteristics: modern tool marks, artificial patina, and stylistic consistency with ancient carvings. Vega photographed each carving and recorded its GPS coordinates. One of the new carvings, located at panel 4, depicted a scene that Vega found particularly disturbing. The image showed a group of human figures clustered together, with lines radiating outward from their heads. Above the figures was a circular symbol divided into quadrants. Vega recognized the style as consistent with other Arctic rock art, but the subject matter was unusual. She consulted with an anthropologist named Dr. Kaiko Yamamoto, who specialized in indigenous symbolism. Yamamoto reviewed the photographs and stated that the imagery resembled warning symbols found in some Arctic cultures' representations of danger, illness, or spiritual disturbance. Yamamoto noted that the specific configuration of the figures and the radiating lines was not documented in any known historical or ethnographic records. The carving appeared to be a modern creation designed to mimic ancient warning iconography. In 2016, the Park Service installed motion-activated cameras at 3 petroglyph sites, including panels 4, 7, and 12. The cameras were checked monthly by park staff. Over the course of the year, the cameras recorded wildlife and occasional researchers, but no unauthorized visitors. In August of 2016, park staff discovered 2 additional new carvings at panel 12. The cameras had not recorded any human activity at the site during the period when the carvings would have been created. Vega submitted a detailed report to the Park Service in September of 2016. She concluded that the new carvings were being created by an unknown individual or group with advanced knowledge of archaeology, conservation science, and indigenous art. The carvings were not random vandalism, but appeared to be deliberate additions to the archaeological record, designed to blend seamlessly with ancient imagery. Vega recommended continued monitoring, and suggested that the Park Service consult with cultural experts to assess the significance of the new imagery. In 2017, a journalist named Samuel Reyes, who covered environmental and cultural issues in Alaska, learned about the case through a contact at the university. Reyes requested access to the Park Service reports and visited Cape Krusenstern in July. He photographed the carvings and interviewed Vega and Sokolov. Reyes published an article in an Alaska-based magazine in October of 2017. The article described the mystery of the new petroglyphs and noted the lack of any identified suspects or motives. The article generated moderate interest. A few readers suggested that the carvings were being created as part of a contemporary art project or a cultural statement. Others proposed that the carvings were being made by someone with access to advanced archaeological techniques, possibly a researcher or conservator. No credible leads emerged. In 2018, park staff discovered 3 more new carvings at Panel 7. The imagery included symbols that had not appeared in previous discoveries, geometric patterns, and what appeared to be representations of celestial objects. Vega analyzed the new carvings and noted that the symbols bore similarities to star charts and navigational markers used by indigenous Arctic peoples, but the specific configurations were not documented in historical records. No further carvings have been reported since 2018. The motion-activated cameras remain in place, but they have not captured any evidence of the carver. The Park Service continues to monitor the sites, and researchers periodically visit to document the condition of the petroglyphs. The carvings remain, 14 in total, scattered across 5 panels, carved by hands that know how to make stone look 4,000 years old. The tool marks are modern. The patina is false, but the intent is unreadable. Warnings carved in a language that was never written, depicting events that were never recorded. And somewhere in the vast quiet of Cape Krusenstern, the person who creates them continues their work, leaving messages on stone for reasons no investigation has been able to determine. I should not know where birds will fly before the birds themselves decide. Cold Bay sits on the southwest tip of the Alaska Peninsula, a narrow finger of land extending toward the Aleutian Islands. The town was established as a military base during World War II, when the United States fortified the region against potential Japanese invasion. At its peak, the base housed thousands of personnel. After the war, the population collapsed. By 2000, Cold Bay was home to fewer than 100 year-round residents, mostly workers, supporting the airport, Coast Guard station, and commercial fishing operations. The landscape is treeless tundra, swept by constant wind. The bay itself opens to the Bering Sea, to the north, and the Pacific Ocean to the south, creating a convergence zone where cold Arctic water meets warmer Pacific currents. The area is ecologically rich, supporting massive populations of seabirds, marine mammals, and fish. Each spring, millions of migratory birds pass through Cold Bay on their way to breeding grounds in the Arctic. The timing of these migrations is remarkably consistent, driven by seasonal cycles refined over millennia. Sea ice forms in Cold Bay each winter, typically from December through April. The ice is not the thick, multi-year pack ice found farther north, but seasonal ice-thin sheets that form, break apart, and reform with the tides and weather. The patterns are chaotic, shaped by wind, current, and temperature. Meteorologists and oceanographers consider sea ice formation to be essentially random at small scales, governed by fluid dynamics and thermodynamics, but not predictable in fine detail. In March of 1997, a commercial fisherman named Vincent LaRoche was working a herring seine operation in Cold Bay. LaRoche had fished Alaskan waters for 20 years and was familiar with the seasonal rhythms of the region. On March 18th, while his vessel was anchored overnight, he photographed the ice formations in the bay. He took the photographs for his personal records, documenting the conditions for future reference. 6 weeks later, in early May, LaRoche photographed the arrival of migrating shorebirds, predominantly bar-tailed godwits, and Pacific golden plovers as they passed through Cold Bay. The birds flew in dense flocks, following established routes that brought them over the water and across the tundra. LaRoche archived his photographs and thought nothing more of them until the following winter. In February of 1998, while reviewing his archives, LaRoche noticed something unusual. The ice formations he had photographed in March of 1997, the arrangement of cracks, pressure ridges, and open water, resembled the flight paths of the birds he had photographed in May. The similarity was not vague or impressionistic. The ice patterns matched the bird routes with striking precision. Lines of open water corresponded to the paths flown by the densest flocks. Pressure ridges aligned with areas where the birds veered or split into smaller groups. LaRoche assumed the similarity was coincidental. Ice and bird behavior were governed by different forces, one physical, the other biological. There was no reason they should correlate. He mentioned the observation to a colleague, a fisherman named Margaret O'Sullivan, who suggested he was seeing patterns where none existed. In March of 1998, LaRoche photographed the ice again. In May, he photographed the birds. When he compared the images later, the correlation appeared again. The ice formations from March matched the bird flight paths from May. LaRoche documented the finding and shared it with O'Sullivan, who reviewed the photographs and agreed that the similarity was difficult to dismiss. Over the next 5 years, LaRoche systematically photographed the ice each spring and the bird migrations each May. He compiled a collection of matched pairs, ice patterns, and bird routes, and found that the correlation held in 13 out of 15 years. In 2 years, the match was weak or absent, but in the others, the ice appeared to predict the bird movements weeks before the birds arrived. In 2003, LaRoche contacted a meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Anchorage, a scientist named Dr. Yolanda Pritchard. LaRoche provided copies of his photographs and described his findings. Pritchard reviewed the images and expressed skepticism. She noted that sea ice formation was driven by wind, current, and temperature, none of which should correlate with bird migration routes. She suggested that LaRoche might be selectively interpreting the data, finding matches where the patterns were ambiguous. LaRoche invited Pritchard to visit Cold Bay and observe the phenomenon firsthand. In March of 2004, Pritchard traveled to Cold Bay and spent a week photographing the ice. She returned in May and photographed the bird migrations. When she compared the images, she found the same correlation LaRoche had documented. The ice patterns from March matched the bird routes from May with a precision she could not explain. Pritchard contacted a colleague, an ornithologist named Dr. Kwame Osei at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Osei specialized in avian migration and was familiar with the flight patterns of shorebirds in the region. Pritchard shared the photographs and asked if the bird routes were predictable based on geography or weather. Osei stated that, while migration routes were generally consistent from year to year, the fine details, the exact paths flown by individual flocks, varied with wind conditions, food availability, and other factors that changed daily. The birds did not follow fixed routes. They adjusted their paths in real time. Osei visited Cold Bay in May of 2005 and observed the migrations. He photographed the flocks and compared his images to the ice formations photographed by LaRoche in March. The correlation held. Osei could offer no biological explanation for why ice would mimic bird behavior weeks in advance. In 2006, Pritchard published a brief note in a regional meteorology bulletin, describing the Cold Bay observations as an unexplained correlation between sea ice patterns and avian migration routes. The note included sample photographs and suggested that further study was warranted. The publication generated limited response. A few scientists contacted Pritchard for additional data, but none pursued the matter. In 2007, a geophysicist named Dr. Helena Novak read Pritchard's note and proposed a hypothesis. Novak suggested that both the ice and the birds might be responding to a common environmental factor such as variations in geomagnetic fields or atmospheric pressure patterns that influenced both ice formation and bird navigation. Novak visited Cold Bay in March of 2008 and deployed magnetometers and atmospheric sensors to measure environmental conditions. She collected data for 6 weeks and found no unusual readings. The geomagnetic field was stable. Atmospheric pressure followed normal patterns. In 2009, LaRoche invited other fishermen working in Cold Bay to participate in the documentation. 3 additional fishermen, Derek Mullen, Astrid Bjornson, and Thomas Begay, agreed to photograph the ice and birds during their operations. Over the next 3 years, the group documented 10 additional instances where ice patterns matched subsequent bird routes. The photographs were archived and shared with Pritchard and Osei. In 2012, a journalist named Hiroshi Tanaka, writing for an environmental science magazine, learned about the Cold Bay observations through a contact at the University of Alaska. Tanaka visited Cold Bay in March and interviewed LaRoche, Pritchard, and Osei. He photographed the ice and returned in May to photograph the birds. His article, published in July of 2012, summarized the findings and noted the absence of a scientific explanation. The article included a selection of matched photographs and encouraged researchers to investigate. The article attracted modest attention. A few online forums discussed the phenomenon, and several amateur researchers attempted to analyze the photographs using pattern recognition software. One analysis, conducted by a data scientist named Dr. Leonard Strauss, confirmed that the correlation was statistically significant and unlikely to be the result of random chance. Strauss could not identify a mechanism that would account for the correlation. In 2014, the National Science Foundation funded a small research project to study the Cold Bay icebird correlation. A team led by Pritchard and Osei spent 2 years collecting data, including high-resolution satellite imagery of ice formations, GPS tracking of bird migrations, and environmental measurements. The team confirmed that the correlation persisted. Ice patterns from March matched bird routes from May in 18 out of 22 documented cases between 1997 and 2016. The research team's final report, published in 2017, concluded that the Cold Bay phenomenon was real and statistically robust, but could not be explained by known physical or biological processes. The report suggested several possibilities: an unknown environmental variable influencing both ice and birds, a feedback mechanism not yet understood, or a coincidence arising from the complex interplay of natural systems. The report recommended continued observation, but did not propose a definitive explanation. In 2018, LaRoche retired from commercial fishing. Before leaving Cold Bay, he donated his archive of ice and bird photographs to the University of Alaska. The collection includes over 200 matched pairs, spanning 2 decades. The archive is available to researchers, but has not been widely studied. Pritchard continues to monitor the phenomenon remotely, reviewing satellite imagery and bird tracking data each spring. She has documented 3 additional instances of correlation since 2018. Osei has shifted his research focus to other topics, but remains in contact with Pritchard and occasionally reviews the Cold Bay data. In 2022, a new pattern emerged. The ice formations in March began to show not only the paths the birds would fly in May, but also areas where the birds would pause to feed. The open water patches in the ice aligned with shallow tidal flats, where the birds would land weeks later. Pritchard documented this development, but has not published her findings. She describes the observation as deeply unsettling in private correspondence, but has not elaborated. The phenomenon continues. Each March, the ice forms. Each May, the birds arrive. And in the space between, the patterns align in ways that should not be possible. The ice does not think. The birds do not plan. Yet the correlation persists, precise and consistent. as though the frozen water knows something about the future that even the living do not. And no one who has studied it can explain why the ice seems to be waiting, tracing routes for journeys that have not yet begun. Some receivers continue listening long after the world stops transmitting. Tin City occupies the western tip of the Seward Peninsula in Alaska, roughly 90 miles northwest of Nome. The location is a narrow spit of land jutting into the Bering Strait, with Siberia visible on clear days just 55 miles across the water. The area was named for tin deposits discovered in the early 1900s, though mining operations were limited and short-lived. By the 1950s, Tin City was uninhabited, except for the occasional prospector or Coast Guard patrol. In 1957, the United States Air Force selected Tin City as one of several sites for the White Alice Communications System, a network of tropospheric scatter radio installations designed to provide long-range communication across Alaska during maybe toward 10. The Cold War. The system used massive dish antennas and high-powered transmitters to bounce radio signals off the troposphere, enabling communication over distances that exceeded line-of-sight radio. White Alice stations were built in remote locations, often staffed by small crews who maintained the equipment in harsh conditions. The Tin City station consisted of 2 large parabolic antennas mounted on towers, several equipment buildings, and a small barracks for personnel. The facility operated continuously until 1978, when advances in satellite communication rendered the system obsolete. The Air Force decommissioned the station, removed most of the sensitive equipment, and abandoned the site. The antennas and buildings remain, slowly deteriorating in the wind and salt air. The location is accessible only by boat, helicopter, or a long overland trek from the nearest road, which itself ends 50 miles away in Wales. In August of 2018, 2 hikers, a geologist named Dr. Marcus DuPont and a wilderness guide named Astrid Kowalski, were conducting a survey of abandoned military sites along the Seward Peninsula. The project was part of a historical documentation effort funded by the Alaska Historical Society. DuPont and Kowalski had spent 3 weeks visiting former radar stations, communication sites, and fuel depots, photographing the structures and recording their GPS coordinates. On August 23rd, they arrived at Tin City by helicopter. The pilot, a man named Jerome Whitfield, dropped them at the site and agreed to return 3 days later. DuPont and Kowalski set up camp near the old barracks and began documenting the facility. The antennas were still standing, though severely corroded. The equipment buildings were locked, but the doors had weakened over the decades, and DuPont was able to force entry into one of the structures. Inside, they found racks of analog radio equipment, vacuum tube amplifiers, frequency modulators, and reel-to-reel tape recorders. Most of the equipment had been stripped of valuable components, but some units remained. DuPont photographed the interior and noted the equipment models for his records. Kowalski, who had a background in electronics, examined the units more closely. She noticed that one of the tape recorders, a large rack-mounted unit, had a reel of tape installed. The tape was old, brittle, and partially unwound. Kowalski attempted to manually turn the reel to inspect the tape. As she did, she heard faint sound coming from the playback head. She stopped and listened. The sound was a voice distorted and low, but recognizable as human speech. She called DuPont over. Together, they carefully wound the tape and positioned it at the beginning of the recording. Kowalski found a portable battery pack in her gear and jury-rigged a connection to power the playback amplifier. The tape played. The recording was a weather report. The voice, male and measured, described atmospheric conditions, wind speed, temperature, and barometric pressure for a location identified as Tin City, Alaska. The report included a date, September 14, 2018. The recording was dated 3 weeks in the future. DuPont and Kowalski reviewed the tape multiple times. The date was clearly stated. The voice provided specific meteorological data: wind from the northeast at 18 knots, temperature 42 degrees Fahrenheit, overcast skies with light precipitation expected. The report lasted approximately 90 seconds and then ended. The rest of the tape was blank. Kowalski examined the equipment. The tape recorder was connected to a radio receiver, which was in turn connected to an antenna feed that led outside the building. The system appeared designed to record radio transmissions automatically. However, the equipment had no external power source. The building's electrical system had been disconnected decades ago. The batteries that might have powered the equipment would have been dead for years. Yet the tape had been recorded. DuPont documented the equipment with photographs and detailed notes. He checked the building for any hidden power sources, generators, solar panels, or battery banks. He found none. The equipment should have been inert. Kowalski tested the radio receiver with a multimeter from her toolkit. The unit showed no electrical activity. It was, by all measurable criteria, dead. On August 25th, DuPont and Kowalski decided to take the tape reel with them when they left. They carefully packaged it in a protective case and documented its removal in their field notes. Whitfield returned on August 26th and flew them back to Nome. DuPont immediately contacted the Alaska Historical Society and described the discovery. The society referred him to the National Archives, which held records related to decommissioned military installations. In September, DuPont traveled to Anchorage and met with an archivist named Dr. Patricia Gould. Gould reviewed the tape and the documentation. She confirmed that the White Alice system had been decommissioned in 1978 and that all operational equipment should have been removed or disabled. She had no explanation for how the tape could have been recorded, let alone how it could contain a date 3 weeks in the future. Gould arranged for the tape to be analyzed by a forensic audio specialist named Dr. Leonard Strauss. Strauss examined the tape in his laboratory in Seattle. He confirmed that the recording was analog, consistent with the technology used in the 1970s. The tape itself showed signs of age, oxidation, brittleness, and magnetic degradation, typical of decades-old media. However, the recording appeared relatively recent. The clarity and frequency response suggested it had been made within the last few years, not decades ago. Strauss analyzed the voice on the recording. He determined it was human, male, and speaking in a neutral, professional tone consistent with meteorological broadcasts. He compared the voice to archived recordings of weather reports from various Alaska radio stations. He found no match. The voice did not correspond to any known broadcaster or automated system. On September 14th, 2018, the date specified in the recording, DuPont and Kowalski returned to Tin City with Whitfield. They brought meteorological instruments to measure the actual weather conditions. At approximately 2 p.m., they recorded the following: wind from the northeast at 17 knots, temperature 41 degrees Fahrenheit, overcast skies with light drizzle. The conditions matched the tape recording with minor variations consistent with measurement error and natural variability. DuPont contacted the National Weather Service and requested historical data for Tin City on September 14th. The Weather Service stated that they did not maintain a monitoring station at Tin City and had no recorded data for that location on that date. The nearest weather stations were in Wales and Nome, both more than 50 miles away. The conditions at those stations on September 14th did not match the Tin City recording. In October, DuPont and Kowalski returned to Tin City a third time, this time with a radio technician named Derek Mullen. Mullen had 40 years of experience with military communication systems and was familiar with White Alice technology. He examined the equipment in the building and confirmed that it had no power source. He tested the antenna feed and found that it was still connected to one of the large dish antennas outside. The antenna was corroded, but structurally intact. Mullen conducted a radio frequency survey of the site. He found no active transmissions on the frequencies used by White Alice. He set up a receiver and monitored the site for 3 days. He detected only background noise and occasional distant signals from commercial aviation and maritime traffic. The White Alice frequencies were silent. Mullen examined the tape recorder more closely. He found that the internal mechanism was seized. The motors and gears were frozen by corrosion and lack of lubrication. The recorder could not have operated without significant mechanical repair. Yet the tape had been recorded. Mullen could not explain how. In November of 2018, DuPont submitted a detailed report to the Alaska Historical Society. The report included all photographs, field notes, audio analysis, and meteorological data. The Society filed the report in its archives, but did not pursue further investigation. A spokesperson stated that the findings were highly unusual, but outside the scope of our historical documentation mission. In 2019, a journalist named Imogen Swift, who covered technology and science stories, learned about the Tin City discovery through a contact at the University of Alaska. Swift interviewed DuPont, Kowalski, and Mullen. She visited the National Archives and reviewed the White Alice decommissioning records. She found documentation confirming that the Tin City station had been officially closed in 1978 and that all equipment had been inventoried and either removed or rendered inoperable. Swift published an article in a technology magazine in March of 2019. The article, titled "The Station That Wouldn't Stop Listening," summarized the discovery and noted the lack of explanation. The article generated moderate online discussion, but no new leads. A few readers suggested that the tape had been planted as a hoax, but Swift noted that the tape's age and condition, confirmed by forensic analysis, made recent fabrication unlikely. In 2020, Kowalski returned to Tin City alone, traveling by boat from Wales. She brought additional recording equipment and spent 4 days at the site. She entered the equipment building and checked the tape recorder. A new reel of tape had been installed. Kowalski had not placed it there. DuPont and Mullen confirmed they had not returned to the site. Kowalski played the tape. It contained another weather report, this time for October 8, 2020. The conditions described were specific. Wind from the southwest at 22 knots. Temperature, 38 degrees. Clear skies. Kowalski noted the date more than 2 weeks in the future from her visit and took the tape with her. On October 8, 2020, Kowalski was unable to return to Tin City due to weather. She contacted a Coast Guard station in Nome and requested weather observations for the Bering Strait region on that date. The Coast Guard provided data from a patrol that had passed near Tin City on October 8th. The reported conditions: wind from the southwest at 21 knots, temperature 39 degrees, clear skies. Kowalski has not returned to Tin City since. The tape recorder remains in the equipment building, its reels slowly turning in a facility that has no power, receiving transmissions from a system that was shut down over 40 years ago. And somewhere in the silent frequencies of the Cold War, a voice continues to broadcast weather that has not yet happened, recorded by machines that should not be listening. Some islands remember visitors who were never there. Pleasant Island sits in Icy Strait, approximately 15 miles west of Gustavus, Alaska, near the entrance to Glacier Bay. The island is roughly 5 miles long and 2 miles wide, covered in old-growth Sitka spruce and western hemlock. The Tlingit people knew it as Guantok, a seasonal fishing and gathering site used for centuries before European contact. In the early 1900s, a small fox farm operated on the island, but it was abandoned by the 1920s. Since then, Pleasant Island has remained uninhabited. The island is part of Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve, though it lies outside the main visitor corridors. Kayakers occasionally camp on its beaches during multi-day trips through Icy Strait. The National Park Service maintains no facilities on the island, and camping is permitted under backcountry regulations. The terrain is dense forest rising from rocky beaches. Black bears are common. The weather is unpredictable, with fog rolling in from the Pacific without warning. Pleasant Island has no history of violence or tragedy, no documented shipwrecks or disappearances. It is not considered dangerous. Park rangers describe it as a typical Southeast Alaska island, beautiful, remote, and unremarkable. Yet since at least 2003, visitors who camp overnight on Pleasant Island have reported experiences that defy simple explanation. In June of 2003, a kayaker named Vincent Ashford spent a night on Pleasant Island's eastern shore. Ashford was an experienced wilderness traveler from Juneau, conducting a solo trip through Icy Strait. He arrived at the island in the late afternoon, set up his tent on a gravel beach, and prepared dinner. He saw no other boats and no signs of recent human activity. He went to sleep around 10 p.m. The following morning, Ashford woke with vivid memories of a conversation he had engaged in the previous evening. He recalled speaking with two other campers, a man and a woman who had arrived after dark and set up camp near his tent. The conversation had lasted over an hour. They discussed weather patterns in Southeast Alaska, kayaking routes, and the history of Pleasant Island. Ashford remembered specific details. The man's voice was deep and deliberate. The woman spoke with a slight accent he could not place, and both seemed knowledgeable about the area. When Ashford emerged from his tent, he found no evidence of other campers, no tents, no kayaks, no footprints in the sand or gravel. He walked the length of the beach and found nothing. He assumed he had experienced an unusually vivid dream and noted it in his journal, but thought little more of it. In August of 2005, a couple from Anchorage, Morris, Thibault, and his partner Lucia Moreno camped on Pleasant Island's western shore. They were traveling together and set up a single tent. During the night, both woke separately and believed they had spoken with a third person, a man who visited their campsite and sat by their fire. Thibault remembered the man asking about their route and offering advice on navigating Icy Strait. Moreno remembered the same conversation. In the morning, they discussed the visit and realized they had both experienced it, but no one had been there. Their campsite showed no signs of another visitor. Thibault and Moreno reported the incident to a Park Service ranger in Gustavus, a man named Derek Sokolov. Sokolov had worked in Glacier Bay for 8 years and was familiar with Pleasant Island. He noted the report but attributed it to a shared dream or a psychological phenomenon related to isolation and exhaustion. He did not investigate further. In 2007, another solo kayaker, a woman named Astrid Kowalski, camped on Pleasant Island and reported a similar experience. She remembered having a long conversation with an older man who appeared at her campsite in the evening. The man spoke about the history of fox farming on the island and described the layout of the old farm buildings, none of which Kowalski had known about beforehand. In the morning, she was alone. She later researched the island's history and confirmed that a fox farm had existed there, though the buildings had been gone for decades. Kowalski mentioned the experience to a friend, who suggested she contact the Park Service. She spoke with Sokolov, who by then had heard 2 additional reports of similar experiences from other visitors. Sokolov began to document the accounts more carefully. He noted that the descriptions of the phantom visitors were consistent across reports: calm, knowledgeable, friendly, and specific in their details. None of the visitors reported feeling afraid. All described the encounters as ordinary until they realized, in the morning, that no one had been there. In 2009, Sokolov compiled a summary of the reports and shared it with a colleague, a Park Service psychologist named Dr. Margaret Nwosu, who worked out of the regional office in Anchorage. Nwosu reviewed the accounts and suggested they might be examples of false memory or hypnagogic hallucinations, experiences that occur in the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep. She noted that isolation, unfamiliar environments, and the sound of wind or waves could contribute to such phenomena. Nwosu visited Pleasant Island In July of 2010, she camped alone on the eastern shore, the same area where Ashford had stayed in 2003. She woke the following morning with clear memories of speaking with two people, a man and a woman, who had sat with her by the fire. She remembered their faces, their voices, and the topics they discussed. She checked her campsite. She was alone. Nwosu documented her experience in a report filed with the Park Service. She stated that the memory felt entirely real and indistinguishable from actual interaction. She noted that she had not been asleep during the conversation, or at least she did not believe she had been. She recommended further study, but acknowledged that the phenomenon did not fit neatly into established psychological frameworks. In 2012, a journalist named Samuel Reyes, who covered environmental and wilderness topics, learned about the Pleasant Island reports through a contact at the Park Service. Reyes requested access to the incident files and interviewed Sokolov, Nwosu, and several of the visitors who had reported experiences. He visited Pleasant Island in August and camped overnight. He woke with memories of a conversation with a man who had visited his campsite. Reyes had been alone. Reyes published an article in an outdoor magazine in October of 2012. The article, titled "The Island That Remembers," described the reports and Nwosu's findings. The article generated interest, and several readers contacted Reyes to report their own experiences on Pleasant Island. The accounts were consistent. Overnight visitors woke with memories of conversations that had not occurred. The phantom visitors were described in similar terms: calm, articulate, knowledgeable about the island and the region. In 2014, a research team from the University of Alaska Southeast visited Pleasant Island to conduct a preliminary study. The team included a psychologist, Dr. Yolanda Pritchard, a neuroscientist, Dr. Leonard Strauss, and a graduate student named Julian Mbatha. They camped on the island for 5 nights, rotating through different locations. 3 of the 4 team members reported experiencing the phenomenon. They woke with memories of conversations with people who had not been present. Pritchard and Strauss documented the experiences in detail. They noted that the memories included sensory information, visual details, voices, even the sensation of warmth from a fire. The memories were not vague or dreamlike, but specific and coherent. Pritchard administered psychological assessments to the team members before and after the trip. She found no evidence of mental illness, substance use, or neurological abnormality. Strauss proposed that the phenomenon might be related to environmental factors unique to Pleasant Island electromagnetic fields, infrasound, or some other variable that could influence brain function. The team conducted environmental measurements during their visit. They found no anomalies. The electromagnetic fields were normal. Infrasound levels were typical for a coastal environment. Air quality, temperature, and other variables were unremarkable. In 2016, the Park Service installed a motion-activated camera on Pleasant Island's eastern shore, near the area where most reports originated. The camera was checked monthly by park staff. Over the course of a year, the camera recorded wildlife and occasional kayakers, but no evidence of unexplained human activity. Visitors continued to report the phantom conversations. In 2018, a filmmaker named Rachel Delacroix produced a short documentary about Pleasant Island. The film included interviews with visitors who had experienced the phenomenon and footage of the island. Delacroix camped on the island during filming and reported waking with memories of a conversation with a woman who had not been there. The documentary aired on a regional public television station and was later posted online, where it attracted a modest audience. One detail emerged consistently across the reports. The phantom visitors often spoke about the same topics. Multiple visitors reported conversations about the island's history, particularly the fox farm. Others described discussions about weather patterns, kayaking routes, or the behavior of local wildlife. In several cases, visitors reported being given advice or warnings about tides, bear activity, or approaching storms that proved accurate. In 2020, a data analyst named Dr. Keiko Yamamoto reviewed all documented reports from Pleasant Island and identified patterns in the descriptions of the phantom visitors. Yamamoto found that certain voices and personalities appeared repeatedly in the accounts. At least 7 different visitors, camping years apart, described speaking with the same older man, his voice, his mannerisms, even specific phrases he used. 3 visitors described a woman with a particular accent. The consistency suggested that the memories were not random but followed a template. Yamamoto proposed that the phenomenon might involve a form of collective memory or shared experience, though she could not explain the mechanism. She noted that the Tlingit people had used Pleasant Island for seasonal activities, and that oral traditions or place-based knowledge might somehow persist in a form that influenced visitors. She acknowledged this explanation was speculative and unsupported by evidence. The Park Service continues to receive reports from Pleasant Island. The pattern has not changed. Visitors camp alone, wake with memories of conversations, and find no evidence of other people. The experiences are described as pleasant, even comforting. No one reports fear or harm, but the memories remain detailed and insistent, impossible to dismiss as simple dreams. And on Pleasant Island, in the quiet hours before dawn, the fog rolls in from Icy Strait, and voices that were never spoken continue to echo in the minds of those who sleep on its shores. The island remembers what visitors have said, or what they will say, or what they believe they said, and no one has determined whether the memories belong to the people who wake with them or to the island itself.